Chapter 1868. Published at 19th of May 2023, 10:27 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 1868. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1868. Arrogance and ignorance. Lionel held out his spear for a long while before slowly retracting it and allowing the blue knight to fall to the ground. He found that without his ability index, his spear force seemed to increase by leaps and bounds with every battle. He had yet to have a battle where he didn't make a large improvement. Every time he sunk into that state of forgetting everything, he would come out an even greater monster on the other side. Just now, he felt his spear transcend the laws of the world around it. Before, his spear was able to ignore space somewhat, extending his blade against several enemies at once and even vanishing to attack across large distances. When he had just entered the tribulation, he could only do so within his absolute spear domain. But just after a few battles, he could extend it well outside and his absolute spear domain had increased in range. Not long after that, he was even able to use his absolute spear domain as less of a defensive measure and even began to use it offensively and change its shape and location, even using it to coat his spear. And just now, he felt like rather than just attacking across space, he could also attack across time. He had been so focused on layering his strikes in a better fashion, with a faster method, with a greater speed, that he had ignored reason and simply did what felt natural. And then it happened. Although he hadn't broken through entirely, Lionel felt that it was only a matter of time. With his improvement speed, how many more battles would it take? Maybe only a handful more at this caliber? Lionel took a breath and exhaled. This time it wasn't because he was tired, but rather because he was sighing. It wasn't that he didn't know that allowing his talent to take over would have such great results, it was just that he was too arrogant to allow it to happen. He had wanted to fundamentally understand what was happening to him. Maybe deep down inside, Lionel knew why this was. Back then, it felt like too many things were entirely out of his control. The world he had grown up in was suddenly had a calamity descend upon it. His father wasn't who he thought he was. His mother was the woman he had ignored and maybe even somewhat hated all his life. His grandfather turned out to be the man everyone on the planet worshipped, and now he was suddenly forced into killing and maiming just to live, something he absolutely did not want to do. Lionel was someone who liked to have everything under his control, everything within his purview, even if that sometimes meant offending those that were closest to him. James' words back then of calling him a sociopathic hypocrite, and then Anna's actions of doing the exact same, was probably perfectly correct. The funniest part was that Lionel knew it. Despite his personality, he was hyper-aware of everything and very emotionally intelligent. He couldn't be a leader without such skills. He had just chosen to ignore it anyway, much to the frustration of a lot of people. Ironically, this tribulation, which was maybe a great challenge to others, was more of a joke to him, at least physically speaking. However, when it came to the truths it forced him to face, it could only be said that maybe this was a different kind of tribulation for Lionel altogether. Lionel waved his spear slowly. Despite the paced movement, he still left after images in the air, forming a wing of spear to his side. The afterimages only faded after a very long while. In that moment, Lionel confirmed and consolidated his gains in this battle. It would be hard to shut off his brain when his ability index returned, but since he was shut away from it in this tribulation, he would allow his talent to bloom. He wanted to see how far his spear force would grow before he was forced to leave this place. Lionel took a step forward and the throne of the Blue Knight shook once before sinking into the ground. By the time Lionel got to the top of the stairs, a platform had appeared. On it, there was a perfect replica of the Blue Knight's spear, radiating the aura of a silver-grade weapon, one Lionel would only be able to gain after clearing 90 more territories. Or, rather, 89 after this one. However, this wasn't all. When Lionel grabbed the spear, strapping his old one to his back, he waved it around and felt its heft. After a moment, a flood of knowledge entered his brain and he learned about the ability of this spear. Knight's Charge. It seemed that rather than gaining a domain with each spear, Lionel would gain an ability instead. Knight's Charge seemed to be the reason for the Blue Knight's obscene straight-line speed. To make up for the heaviness of the spear, it allowed nigh instant distance collapsing. When Knight's Charge was activated, he could accelerate in a straight line, closing up to 100-meter distance in the blink of an eye. Of course, the drawback was that stopping was almost impossible. However, that could be mitigated because the distance of the charge could be decided by the activator ahead of time. You just had to trust in your own judgment. Lionel didn't know how often he would use this ability the way it was meant to be used, but he felt it had great potential in increasing attack potency. Eggless novel C.O.M. Lionel waved the enormous spear around for a few rounds before he got used to it and nodded himself. Then, he turned and left. He had wasted enough time here. With that Enel charrowed toward a new territory and then another. It wouldn't be long until he met his next Urukai, and maybe that was exactly what he wanted. He was loving the challenge. Chapter 1869. Published at 19th of May 2023 10:27 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1869. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1869. Never enough. Ellerin didn't get up immediately, listening to the message in complete silence. It was only after an entire half hour that he stood. As he did so, his body seemed to leave afterimages in its wake despite the fact he wasn't moving very fast. Suddenly, all of those afterimages snapped into one before the process started again, and then again. Ellerin seemed to realize what was happening and shook his head before waving a hand and dispersing the odd force in the air. After a yawn, he patted down his still pristinely white tracksuit that didn't have even a slight stain on it despite the fact he had just been lying in the grass and began to walk forward. Under some mysterious power, he appeared dozens of kilometers away, but somehow still seemed to be standing in place. Like a rubber band, his afterimage snapped into the distance, fusing with himself dozens of kilometers ahead. Every step Ellerin took, the process repeated until he stepped into the air, shot through the atmosphere, and began to stroll through the depths of space. He's been contacted, Raffer said confidently. Things will get started now. On Earth, a silent movement began to take place. At that moment, a familiar young man walked into an estate with slow and deliberate steps. He stood at just over 2 meters tall and had exceptionally broad shoulders and large palms. Just shaking his hand would make one feel as though you were enveloped by his aura and presence, if not for his sturdy and unbothered demeanor. Everywhere this young man passed, servants and passers-by would respectfully greet him. This man was none other than James Bennet, a man who could formerly be said to have been the best friend of Lionel, and the very man who had betrayed him not once, but twice, the first being during their championship game, and the second being during Lionel's escape from the Royal Blue Fort. Right now, though, James was no longer the James of the past. At the very least, the Bennet family wasn't the Bennet family of the past. Instead, they had regained their title as Governor Duke family following the fall of the Siegfried family. James' father's plan had worked. Over 20 years ago, James didn't know why his father had made him go to the Siegfried family and reveal that it had been Lionel who killed their son, Conrad Siegfried. But time had shown that his father was simply far more shrewd than he was. Conrad was the very young man that Aina had killed the moment Lionel stepped out from his very first zone. It was an event that had shocked Lionel awake to the fact that the young woman he had been chasing after for so many years wasn't who he had thought she was. But even Lionel couldn't have guessed that this would be the catalyst for the rise of the Bennet family once again. Just that seed planted so many decades ago led to the fall of the Siegfried. Learning that Lionel had killed their son had left the Siegfried quite suffocated. Around that time was also the time that news that Lionel was the prince of the empire also spread, so how could a mere Governor Duke family dare to lay hands on him? Without a choice, they could only swallow their dissatisfaction. But it only continued to brew inwardly, especially after the Siegfried family missed their chance to join the Void Palace during the first round. Back then, Lionel had brought along many of Earth's geniuses with him to planet Luxnix, but he had never cared to note that the Siegfried family wasn't among them, but James' father had pulled strings to make certain that things would happen this way. Of course, the Siegfried family wasn't the only one that lost their opportunity to join, as even James didn't join as well. But this result made it look like the Fox family had not only condoned the killing of their son, but were even actively trying to suppress them so that they never gained a chance at revenge. The general population might see Emperor Fox as a god, but the noble families knew exactly how ruthless this man could be. This was the very same man who said that they were free to keep hunting his own grandson and that he would reward him if they could pull it off. This was simply not the type of ruler you crossed, and if you managed to get on his bad side, you had to try your best to get out from under his power. So that was what the Siegfried had done. They thought they had gained an opportunity to flip the tables during the war against the four families, siding with the Lavis family when they thought they had gained a valuable chance. But in the end, their choice had ruined them. They were entirely crushed and their family was wiped out. Things wouldn't have happened as smoothly as this, or they would have at least been able to escape and join the remnants of the other families outside of Earth's territory, but as things went, how could James' father let this opportunity slip by? The Siegfried's family's deeds were reported by none other than the Bennett family, which eventually led a family of Tier 5 officials who had fallen from grace to regain their standing as governor dukes, a path that was made easier due to their legacy and the past. When this had happened, it had been the happiest day of James' life. He had thought that now that the Bennett family had finally regained their honor, he would be free, he could finally live the carefree life he had always wanted to, he could sleep with as many women as he wanted, drink until he couldn't see straight. Maybe even rekindle his friendship with the person he missed the most in the world, apologizing on his hands and knees if he had to. But how could things ever be so simple? How could he not have seen that to his father, returning to the status of Governor Duke was just the beginning? To him, nothing was ever enough. Now that they had climbed one peak, he wanted to aim for another. Egglesnell today, James' father had called him in once again. James entered his father's office, feeling the same suffocating pressure he always had. The man now had on a stern expression, the smile he had worn the day he regained his great-grandfather's honor long since wiped away. "It's time, James' father," Governor Duke Bennett spoke evenly. "In 3 days' time, half of the Slayer Legion will rebel, launching an attack from within the capital." James' heart skipped a beat. Chapter 1870. Published at 19th of May 2023 10:27 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1870. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1870. That's it. Lionel took a deep breath. Truthfully, waving this lance spear around was much more troublesome than the enemies themselves. No beast he crossed seemed to be capable of lasting even a single strike. The value of holding a silver-grade spear while facing what Lionel assumed were bronze-grade threats in the eyes of this tribulation was undeniable. As time passed, Lionel realized that reserving Knight's charge was actually a foolish decision and his skill in wielding the spear increased with every exchange. Rather than relying on his own strength to gather up momentum, he would execute Knight's charge in short bursts, cleverly applying it to accelerate his attack speed and potency while keeping his attacks entirely unpredictable. Knight's charge didn't seem to have any limitations on it at all, there was no cooldown, and it didn't take anything out of Lionel's stamina, making him realize just how valuable these treasure territories were. The only limitations were that once a distance had been chosen, the charge couldn't be stopped, that there was a limited range of about 100 meters, and finally, it could only be used in a straight line directly ahead of Lionel. When Lionel made this adjustment, he began to shred through opposition and the rate his stamina drained at was even less than it had been before. This led to an exaggerated result where it didn't even seem like he was sweating as he battled. This time, Lionel faced off against Cloud Race Man. He had faced off against quite a number of other races by this point. In fact, as Nelligan's words had made quite obvious, by this stage, most humans would have either been eliminated or have chosen to withdraw themselves, so this outcome was unsurprising. What was more surprising was the fact that Lionel was still here. The Cloud Race Man had thought he had gotten a lucky break to come up against such an easy opponent for his 10th territory, even to the point that he didn't bother to scan Lionel initially. But after a few exchanges and finding himself on the back foot, he realized that he had underestimated Lionel greatly. What shocked the Cloud Race individual the most was the fact that Lionel didn't seem to be trying very hard, as though he was probing something. Gritting his teeth, the runes within his cloud figure shimmered to life and a wave of strength fell over Lionel. Very quickly, everything about his combat style was downloaded and stored. Eventually, the Cloud Race Man seemed to gain the upper hand, even somewhat suppressing Lionel. Interesting, Lionel thought. The abilities of the Cloud Race were extraordinary. When taken to the logical extreme, and paired with their incredible mental capacities, their battle style could practically allow them to predict the future just by using the model they had of you in their mind. One of the very first dreams Lionel had ever had for his ability index was to be able to do this, but even until now, he hadn't been able to accomplish it, and that was despite the fact he had gained the ability to scan people with his dream world. And yet, people of the cloud race could just do so naturally and without any trouble whatsoever. There's a secret here, and that secret should be hidden within the weakness of this ability. Lionel's battle tactics suddenly changed and he began to incorporate Knight's Charge once again. His battle style became entirely unpredictable and erratic. However, what was fascinating to him was that this didn't throw off the cloud race young man. Lionel began to overwhelm the cloud race young man not because he became unpredictable, but because his strength simply far outstripped the latter. Eggless novel no, let's change tactics. Lionel pulled back his strength and changed tactics again. But, once more, he began to be suppressed by the cloud race young man. Fascinating. Is this ability really flawless? Lionel's gaze flickered and it landed on the dancing runes within the cloud race young man's cloud figure. Maybe the craziest part about this race's ability was just how non-invasive and nigh undetectable it was. If not for Lionel's own sensitivity and deductive abilities, he would have even been able to tell that Captain Vimward had scanned him in the first place. But then again, Lionel's own dream world was almost undetectable as well. Lionel had a feeling that by analyzing the cloud race, even if he couldn't gain their ability, his comprehension of dream force would definitely touch an all-new level. By this point, the cloud race young man was infuriated. He could tell that Lionel was just toying with him, but there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. Damn it. Fight me. Lionel blinked and slipped to the side of a wild spear attack. Oh, so that's your weakness, Lionel suddenly said. The words were simple, but they somehow felt like the whisper of the Reaper to the cloud race youth. He shuddered in fear, but the tip of Lionel's spear had already collided with his chest, shattering every bone in it. He couldn't even hold onto the spear in his own hands as it had been ripped out by Lionel. Before he could even land, his body began to vanish. Clearly, his spear had already been claimed by Lionel. Lionel turned and walked away, slaughtering the last of the beasts in this region. He didn't even bother to absorb their beast crystals because by this point, these lowest level beasts had no effect on him. It's still a bit surface level, though. Relying on an enemy to lose focus isn't the way to go, but it is a look into how they operate. There should be other methods of restricting and countering them. There should be. Lionel's gaze glowed. He had it, that was it. 12 more territories until I reached the silver grade since this guy gave me 10 including this region. Lionel finished clearing the region swiftly. But when he stepped into his next target, his gaze sharpened. He sensed another member of the cloud race, but this one made the other look like a toddler in a playpen. Their gazes met and silence echoed. Chapter 1871. Published at 19th of May 2023 10:27 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1871. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1871. Alarina was quite surprised to see a human enter her territory. Well, this couldn't truly be considered her territory as she too had just stepped into it. By coincidence, the two of them had entered at near the same time from adjacent directions. They had hardly taken a step when they noticed one another and immediately changed their focus. What surprised her even more, though, was that despite seeing her, this human wasn't afraid. This was definitely new to her. Let alone humans, even members of other races who saw her would be very afraid. This wasn't because she looked like a monster or anything, it was quite the opposite, in fact. The reason was because much like the other races, her talent had very strong physical signs. Alarina was all face just like the other members of her race. She looked like a sculptor that had had the back half of her head removed, but rather than making her look weird, with the flowing cloud that made up her brain and seemingly also her hair, not to mention the golden runes floating within it, it made her look like an ethereal deity untouched by mortality. The features of her face were especially gentle, the only sharpness coming from her small nose. The curves of her cheeks and jaw were all perfect and feminine in an almost exaggerated way, making her look like the representation of what a perfect woman might be. Her eyes reflected the cloud figure that flowed behind her, dancing with golden runes as well. Much like the rest of her race, it made her look like a hollowed mask being carried by a tail of ethereal clouds, if said mask was of a goddess descended from above, that is. Alarina's cherry lips curled, her cloud figure sparkling like twinkling stars. Usually when she did this, most wouldn't be able to stand looking at her anymore and would turn away in either embarrassment or a feeling of unworthiness, but Lionel simply continued to look at her without a word, his expression not giving much away. He had seen many beauties before, this wasn't enough to move him. Plus, Alarina relied much more on her aura and disposition to pressure him, which was even more fool's gold. If she thought such a thing would work, there was only disappointment in store for her. Eagles Nova 1, oh, you're an interesting human, Alarina said lightly. Someone else told me that before. Oh. And where are they now? Since I'm here, isn't it obvious? Alarina released a bell-like laughter. What an arrogant man. Lionel's own lip curled into a sneer. He had heard that one too, but he didn't feel like repeating himself. With a glance at Alarina's spear, he could tell that she had cleared between 20 and 30 regions. This was a far cry from his own almost 90, but given his advantages in this matter, Alarina was definitely very impressive, and that was especially so since she had done it without a special spear like his own. Even so, judging by the armor that coated her voluptuous body, although she hadn't gained a specialty spear, she had definitely received other rewards. Let me see if you have skills warranting that arrogance. Alarina took a step forward and charged, but to her surprise, before she could properly build up momentum, she was interrupted. Lionel activated Knight's charge and crossed the distance to her even faster than what she could muster, lancing his spear forward and aiming right for her chest plate without regard for her gender in the slightest. Alarina's gaze narrowed. Her armor released a light glow and a pulse of light jetted outward with her as the center. Lionel immediately found the speed and power of his spear cut in half. Clang! Taking advantage, Alarina deflected Lionel's blade, sliding her own along its underside and snaking it toward Lionel's throat. It was clear that she was exceptionally skilled, and she had gained quite a bit of practice using her armor as well. But what she didn't expect was Lionel's nonchalant response. Rather than panicking, Lionel slightly shifted the trajectory of his spear, not fighting back against Alarina's blow, but rather deflecting his own spear even further upward. Then, he activated Knight's charge once again, this time for a short distance. His feet shifted and he suddenly covered a 2 feet distance in the blink of an eye, almost as though he had just teleported there. Alarina's spear, which had been aimed for Lionel's throat, was found to be off course due to Lionel's slight adjustment and it barely slid by and over his shoulder by a centimeter or two. Bang! Alarina suffered a solid knee to her torso. Lionel had used the momentum of Knight's charge to not only dodge, but to also gather up strength for this attack, and the results were devastating. Alarina, caught off guard, had all the wind in her body knocked out, a mouthful of blood flying from her soft cherry lips as she was sent flying backward like a cannonball. Lionel shifted his lance-like spear again and activated Knight's charge once more, closing the distance between himself and Alarina in a blink. Alarina, despite being disoriented, reacted quickly, activating her armor's ability once more and half Lionel's strength and speed. But her timing this time was off. Lionel's Knight's charge stopped just outside the range of the ripple of life before he activated Knight's charge again and swung down with a vicious momentum. Bang! Alarina coughed out another mouthful of blood, her inner organs rattling. It was only now she realized that Lionel's strength and raw speed were so much greater than her own. Just how many beast crystals had he swallowed until now? If not for her armor, she would have already been severely injured beyond the point of continuing in this tribulation. She couldn't believe that she was losing so sound to a human. Lionel landed above Alarina, his spear glowing with a fierce light as he pierced downward. One spear to connect the earth and skies. Chapter 1872. Published at 19th of May 2023 10:27 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1872. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1872. Awakening. Compared to the last time Lionel had used this strike, it was countless times more powerful, not only because of the spear he was using, but also because his comprehension of spear force was far deeper. Alarina saw the light of death, a completely contradictory concept. It was as though Lionel was gracing her with it rather than throwing her into an abyssal hell of no return. She never thought that she would die in this way, she hadn't even brought out her full strength. However, just when she thought she would die, Lionel's blade came to a sudden stop right above her face. Their eyes met and he pulled back, leaping out from the pit he had created when he first smashed her into the ground and landing at its ledge. Alarina was immediately confused. Why had Lionel spared her? Could it be because she was a woman? This both made her somewhat angry but also uncomfortable at the same time. She wasn't an ungrateful person, but she also wouldn't sell her dignity for her life either. Get up, Lionel's cold voice suddenly knocked her out of her fantasies. Any thought she had of Lionel suddenly falling in love with her seemed to have been thrown out of the window. That wasn't the voice of a man who was enraptured with her and her appearance at all. Alarina had already been standing to begin with. She had no idea what was going on, so she had already been ready to keep fighting. But something about the sound of Lionel's voice and his gaze made her feel a combination of suffocated and infuriated. You are the most powerful member of the cloud race in this tribulation, right? Then show me your real strength before I send you away. Alarina was far too arrogant and had ended up losing before she even knew what was happening. However, Lionel's vision was far beyond this tribulation. He already didn't plan on coming in second place to anyone. The more important thing to him was learning more about the cloud race so that he could counter them better in the future. Currently, the cloud race had infiltrated the human domain and their claws were sunk far deeper than Lionel knew, that much he was certain of. If he wanted to deal with them, would need something more tangible than what he had, and there was no better target than one of their absolute geniuses. When Alarina heard Lionel's words, she gripped her spear so hard that her fingers bled and her figure trembled. Clenching her jaw, she looked toward Lionel, the golden runes dancing in her cloud figure beginning to tremble as well. She didn't say a single word. There was nothing else to say. She would make him regret the choice he had made to spare her and then humiliate her. Deep within the territory of Earth, all seemed peaceful. Ever since Lionel's return, everything had flowed smoothly, from the destruction of the Zoltine faith and the four great families, to the subduing of the Thrusting Skies sector and the expulsion of the Viola family. Everything had gone perfectly. The absence of Lionel didn't even seem to be felt and all things continued to run smoothly. But, all things would seem to be perfect until the day they weren't. Boom! The explosion came suddenly and without the slightest hint of warning. Almost instantly, half of the Ascension tree that acted as the Ascension Empire's capital was covered in a blinding pillar of flames that seemed to want to engulf it all. Guards that had been on patrol hurried to figure out what was happening, only for their own comrades to suddenly turn on them without reason. Several golden spears pierced through the backs of loyal Imperial guards. They hardly had time to look back in shock toward faces they had known for decades before they collapsed to the ground with unwillingness, their consciousnesses fading to nothing. All hell had broken loose, and though a call to arms was immediately sent to many of the highest noble families of Earth, to the surprise of many of the court ministers, some directly ignored the summons as though they had never received it at all, locking down their own territories and forming their own small countries, defecting from the Ascension Empire. At that moment, on the second of Earth's 2 moons, Avalon, King Arthur sat on his throne, Queen Guinevere to his side. Before him, there was the smiling face of a member of the Lavis family, a young man with flowing golden hair and blinding golden eyes. It's time, King Arthur. The attack should have gotten underway already. You only need to do what the others have and Avalon will be yours. Close your borders, declare independence, and when the times comes, reject delegation. The Ascension Empire has humiliated the Pendragon family for far too long. You are a people of royalty, and yet you've been downgraded to the status of a mere duke. I can understand your frustration. The Fox family haven't done anything to deserve the role they've had ever since they conquered Earth to begin with. Even now, they rely on a childlike prince to handle everything for them, and do you think that this is really that prince's doing? Arthur's gaze sharpened and the young man chuckled. Does it even make sense to you that a young man who's lost over 2 decades of progress in comparison to his peers can still be this far ahead? Who else do you think is working behind the scenes to ensure that all of this happens if not the Morales? He and the Morales must really think everyone is a fool. The young man didn't realize that as he spoke, Arthur's grip on his throne began tighter and tighter while Guinevere's lips pressed into a line. Even so, if you looked at the latter more closely, it was clear that this was a practiced gesture to hold back her laughter. We will expose them for the frauds they are, and then everyone will turn on the Morales family as they should. When they face the pressure of the entire human domain, they will crumble like dash. Crack. Arthur's throne shattered as he stood to his feet. He's just a child, huh? No one could possibly lose to him, right? He's nothing more than a convenient puppet on a string, Then why did I lose to him? The young man was stunned, but Arthur had already unsheathed his sword. Before he could react, he found himself looking at his own headless body, his eyes widened in shock. Egglesnell Arthur sheathed his blade and began to pace about with a harumph. Finally, Guinevere couldn't hold back her laughter anymore and released a bell-like giggle. Arthur's head snapped over. What's so funny? Guinevere laughed even harder. Husband, if you wanted an excuse to follow Lionel, you could find a better one than this, don't you think? Arthur's lip twitched. What do you mean by that? Guinevere just laughed and didn't respond, causing Arthur to click his tongue. Whatever, let those idiots do what they want. I have no intention of getting on that little monster's bad side. They think the Morales are the ones pulling the strings, so now that they're occupied by that summit they're holding, everyone else can run wild and free. Well, they're in for a rude awakening. Chapter 1873. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 50 seconds p.m. Chapter 1873. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1873. Single Tirprev. Chapter Lionel exhaled a breath. His body was covered in cuts and bruises, blood coating some of his white furred armor. On the ground before him, Alarina laid at the end of her rope. It was clear that even after Lionel had given her a chance, the ultimate victory still remained in his hands. At this point, Alarina didn't feel like she had any more excuses to give. Even so, Lionel didn't seem to be proud of his achievement. In fact, he was a hint unhappy. Even with his advantage in strength and speed, the battle had been a tough one. After Alarina copied his movements, she seemed to know everything he would do ahead of time. One would think that rather than copying, the ability of the cloud race was to see the future. Compared to the first cloud race individual Lionel had fought, Alarina was definitely on an entirely different level, and Lionel felt that if their strengths were equal, the one on the ground now would probably be him. But that was precisely why he had taken this chance to begin with. He wouldn't risk a loss here, especially after he had already confirmed victory. That would be nothing more than hubris. Lionel reached down and took Alarina's spear. He had gotten enough from her. Who are you? Alarina asked weakly. Lionel Morales, Lionel replied blandly. Alarina fell into silence. She didn't recognize the name at all. Not only had she lost to a human, but he didn't even seem to be a place she recognized, or maybe he was, but was from a weaker family. But then how did he get his hands on a spear domain ring? There was no way the stronger families would allow the weak to monopolize such a treasure. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't have the answers she was looking for. Alarina's body shimmered out of existence, leaving behind nothing but her armor. Lionel looked at the armor for a moment before shaking his head. Truthfully, although his own armor had less functionality, he preferred it. Reaching down, he picked up the armor and thought for a moment. Although he didn't want the armor, it still felt foolish to just leave it. He thought about modifying it, but the main problem was that without little Tolly by his side, manipulating metal was too difficult. An idea flashed in Lionel's mind. Obviously, since this armor had been left behind, he could use it. Though Alarina was a member of the cloud race and not a human, she still had the more petite body of a human woman, meaning her and Lionel's sizes couldn't be compared. This meant one thing: the armor had shape and size-changing functionality. I can take advantage of that. Lionel began to take the armor apart quickly, finding the force arts responsible for the shape changing. After making sure to preserve them, he began to restructure the other force arts, piecing together what he had while throwing away much of it. Good. About an hour later, Lionel finished. What was left of the robust armor were just a few wrist, elbow, knee, ankle and neck bands. Every time Lionel snapped one piece on, a radiant aura would echo outward and seamlessly fuse with his hermit-like armor. Soon, it became exceptionally subtle. It was hard to tell he had changed anything at all, but the aura his armor exuded alone seemed far more powerful. Grabbing Alarina's spear, he allowed it to fuse with his original spear. With a whoosh, his spear broke through the bronze grade and entered the silver grade. Lionel waved the spear around for a moment and then looked at the lance spear. He decided to keep using the latter since it came with the added functionality of Knight's Charge. After exhaling a breath, Lionel's gaze sharpened. Bring it on. With a thought, Lionel's territories fused and the roar of beasts began to echo. The powerful evolved beasts spawned one after, their furious roars echoing with greater and greater vitality with every passing moment. Lionel took a step and vanished. His white fur coat fluttered, with a spear strapped to his back and one in his hands, he dove into another bloodthirsty battle. The commotion that gripped Earth seemed to have overturned everything. There was chaos, and yet in some regions everything was quiet, too quiet. It was as though pockets of different worlds were forming along the planet's surface one after another. Hacker Hutch stood in the midst of the commotion, stunned. He didn't quite know how to react to this situation. His blade, which had always lusted for battle, seemed to have gone dull. Inwardly, he sighed. Despite the fact his improvements had allowed him to keep living, he had always felt old at heart. This era had come far too late and his prime had long since passed. He didn't have the raging will he once had as a youth, and that was simply something he had no choice but to accept. Seeing everything he had worked all his life for come crumbling down, he simply didn't have the heart for it. During the war with Terrain he had sensed something amiss, as though a shadow was slowly circling his Slayer Legion and waiting for an opportunity to pounce, but it had already been 2 decades since then, so he had hoped that he was wrong. He had poured everything he had into this Slayer Legion, he had bled real blood. Back then, it was he who stood at the front lines and fought against so many city lords all on his own just to protect the budding youth of the Slayer Legion. And yet now what? Was he supposed to raise the same blade that had protected them to cut them down now? Hutch's heart trembled as his head slowly turned. In the distance, through the burning fires that threatened to raze the palace to the ground, a young man wearing a white tracksuit walked forward seemingly quite slowly, and yet whenever his afterimages snapped back together, he would have already moved countless kilometers. Hutch's lip quivered and he closed his eyes, a single tear falling down his cheek. Chapter 1874. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 50 seconds p.m. Chapter 1874. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1874. Wiprev. Chapter Hutch only closed his eyes for only a moment, but it felt like an eternity. Everything about his life seemed to flash by, and yet it hardly seemed to have anything to do with him at all. No matter what memory he recalled, they always seemed to revolve around the very same little boy, his pride and joy, his grandson. Hutch didn't know when it was he had completely lost his grip on Ellerin. Maybe he was too focused on the Slayer Legion, maybe it was because he placed too much emphasis on his loyalty, neglecting the needs of the child, maybe he hadn't shown the little one enough love, enough care, enough affection. He had always closed one eye to such events. Even back then when his grandson had held a blade to his neck, seemingly thinking that Hutch was unconscious, Hutch had been aware of his surroundings the whole time. He had even been naively happy when his grandson chose not to kill him, as though this was something a person should get extra points for. When Hutch opened his eyes again, though it had only been a moment, his grandson was already just 5 meters from him. Even amidst the chaos, there seemed to be a moment of silence. The tear that streamed down Hutch's cheek fell to the ground and seemed to quickly vanish. Hutch couldn't remember the last time he had cried. It hadn't happened even when his daughter and son-in-law passed away, not when his wife had passed away, not when brothers and sisters left this world before him. However, seeing his grandson stand before him like this broke something within him. As he looked toward Ellerin, he thought about the conversation he had with Lionel back when he brought Emna to train with him. Although Lionel hadn't come out and said it directly, everything about his words seemed to drop hints for the inevitability of the current decision. Lionel was simply too good at coddling the feelings of others. He didn't even waste his time trying to convince a grandfather that a grandson would stab him in the back. Even so, how much experience did Hutch have? Didn't he already know that this was inevitable? Hutch's grip on his machete loosened. He couldn't seem to gather up the strength to hold onto it tightly. Why? This was all Hutch could say. In truth, he didn't even expect an answer. He knew his grandson too well. He wasn't a man who liked to speak much and was often in his own world. When he was much younger, Hutch used to think that it was because his grandson was a bit antisocial and lazy, but as time passed, he realized that whenever his grandson lounged around, he would come back even stronger than before, and it wasn't that he was antisocial, it was more accurate to say that he couldn't be bothered to deal with the people around him. However, to his surprise, Ellerin actually answered. It was a short and succinct answer, but it was an answer nonetheless. The Ascension Empire killed my parents. The Ascension Empire deserves death. There didn't seem to be any rage or fury in Ellerin's words, he simply stated them with the ease of talking about the weather. His gaze didn't fluctuate, his radiance didn't dim, his expression didn't even flicker. Hutch tried to open his mouth to respond, but everything felt empty. Ellerin's parents didn't have the necessary talent. This was something their gene assessment made very clear. They lived very normal lives and didn't even interact with Hutch very much due to his own duties. Hutch was just lucky that he was privy to the truth of the Slayer Legion, and as such, was able to allow some members of his family the freedom to be normal. Others were much less lucky, completely unaware that the rebellion of the Slayer Legion was a facade. They embroiled their entire lives in that fight. It was likely due to this dissatisfaction that so many had turned on the Empire now. One could easily imagine, then, how Ellerin's parents had died. As two completely normal individuals, they were almost guaranteed to become invalids. When the metamorphosis descended, they were among the first to fall from the skies, being crushed to death even before the awakening of their ability index could fail. Ellerin was far too intelligent. It was easy to put two and two together. Even without having all of the information, it was obvious that the Ascension Empire had chosen to sacrifice his parents, to kill them along with the other invalids, just to ensure that their evolution path was smoother. Even if there was just a 1% chance that his parents succeeded in awakening, it was still not a 0% chance. But in order to play to the odds, the Ascension Empire hadn't hesitated to sacrifice tens of billions of people. 1% or even 0. 1% was a small number. But of such a large number, how many tens of millions were unjustly slaughtered? And what if his parents were among that number? And so you'll stand in opposition to the only family you have left because of this? Hutch asked with a hoarse voice. I think you should be asking yourself that question, Ellerin replied, reaching toward his back. At that moment, a rusted machete arched through the air, seemingly zipping through time to land in Ellerin's palm. By the time Ellerin lowered his arm, it felt as though the machete had always been there, as though he had stitched together different causalities until he found the one that granted him this weapon. Hutch looked toward the machete. He recognized it all too well. By now, it was decades old, forged of Earth's third-dimensional technologies. It was the very same machete he had gifted his daughter for her 13th birthday. Although she never had the talent for it, she swung it around every day with a childish enthusiasm. Hutch could still remember that look of excitement on her little face, and years of pain and agony came flooding forward all at once. Hutch howled into the skies with a hint of madness in his eyes as he and his grandson attacked at the same time. Chapter 1875. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 50 seconds p.m. Chapter 1875. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1875. Smile Prev. Chapter. Hutch's skin reddened, his eyes glazing over with a furious intent. When he swung his machete, it looked as though a crimson wave followed his every action. Those near him on the battlefield fell to their knees, unable to withstand the world's shaking pressure. Ellerin calmly stepped forward, his own blade moving quite slowly, and yet it reached his grandfather just in time. The two seemed to glide by one another, barely touching. All noise vanished and the world seemed to freeze before all hell broke loose. Clang! Boom! The glancing blow caused a booming wind to slice in all directions. Elrond's pristinely white tracksuit rustled wildly within the wind, almost as though it was trying to rip a path off of his body. At the same, Hutch's shirt was shredded to pieces, revealing a bronzed and powerful figure that didn't seem to match the old features of his face in the slightest. The two only paused for a moment before their strengths erupted. Their figures danced around the battlefield, every clash leaving a crater in their wake, and yet their creation seemed to lag behind, taking 3 collisions before the earth seemed to catch up to what was happening and finally collapse. Hutch's enraged howls echoed all across the earth, the pain and fury within them causing the hearts of all those who heard it to race uncontrollably. He fought like an absolute madman. None of his strikes seemed to have any sort of reason to them. He sliced from all angles, gathering momentum from impossible positions and erupting from irreparable positions. Elrond calmly countered. Anyone with the eyesight to keep up with what was happening felt as though 3 of Elrond were fighting just one of Hutch. Due to this, his slow movements always seemed to counter his grandfather's fast and erratic ones with ease. However, on the other side, Hutch didn't seem to be struggling very much at all either. His stamina felt endless and the bloody ocean wave that was his blade was relentless and all-encompassing. This was the first time in a long while those of Earth had seen Hutch battle, and for some, this was the first time period. The old glory of the hacker Hutch name seemed to have been entirely forgotten, but on this day it was revitalized. No one felt that it was too weak that Hutch hadn't won yet. Rather, they were only more shocked by Elrond's strength. A pair of grandson and grandfather, one furious, another calm, one bound by duty, the other bound by piety. Bang! 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 Blade force rippled out in all directions, bringing with it a suffocating sort of presence. A cyclone of the sharp force twirled around the two of them, shredding apart everything in its path and suffocating all opposition. It reached the point where it was almost impossible to hold any other battles in the vicinity as the pair completely went all out without a hint of their familial ties holding them back. Hutch's blade pierced forward, shredding forth like a torrential storm. Rather than a blade, it looked far more like a meat grinder. Blade force stuck out in all directions, rotating akin a drill, and yet having no form or shape at the same time. The more the battle went on, the more violent Hutch's blade force seemed to become, and yet it was this very violence that he somehow also seemed to have absolute perfect control over. Elrond gilded back, his arms shifting forward to parry with his own blade just once, and yet the after images of over 10 blades formed at once, causing 10 echoes to resound as he glided back another step. Despite his clever dispersal, Hutch's blade was relentless. The 10 strikes seemed to disperse some of the circulation patterns on the rotating force, but the total number were far too numerous. For the first time, Elrond's expression changed somewhat and his gaze narrowed as his grandfather's blade continued forward unimpeded. The blade appeared before him, ready to pierce through his head, but at that moment Elrond's figure seemed to ripple. The blade that should have taken his head passed right through him as though striking a puddle of water and piercing a reflective image instead of the target. The momentum of Hutch's blade died and Elrond's own blade danced. At that moment, the rust on the blade seemed to flake off one peel of gruesome brown red at a time, falling to the ground like the fall of an ashen snow. The strike was perfect, so perfect that the winds sang and the stars shimmered, the force of the world guiding his blade toward Hutch's neck. Hutch reacted quickly, blade force rippling out of his body like a sharp nail, radiating in all directions. It only paused Elrond's machete for a moment, but it was enough time for him to pull back his own blade. He raised the hilt to his neck, separating his ring and middle finger to allow Elrond's blade to perfectly land in the space between all while deflecting his blow. Elrond reacted nonchalantly, twisting his wrist slightly in an attempt to sever his grandfather's fingers, however Hutch's battle experience was high. He clamped his fingers down first and pushed down, changing the direction of Elrond's blade and countering his twist. He released the blade a moment later, stepping forward with a made look in his eye. There was nothing between him and his grandson anymore, no fictitious barriers, no heavy tolls, no blade. Hutch's free hand pierced forward, covered by blade force as he thrust toward Elleren's chest with a vicious light in his eye. His life flashed before his eyes once again. The day he was assessed to have talent and shipped away from his own parent, the day he made his first friends, the day he picked out the weapon that called to him. The day he met the love of his life, the day they had their first child, the day he carried his grandson in his arms for the first time, only to be forced to put him down and escape into the night so that his daughter wouldn't be forced to feel his separation again, the day he appeared in their lives again to whisk their son away. The furious light in Hutch's gaze blurred, flooding over with tears. However, his speed didn't lessen and his striking power didn't weaken. Even so, just before his fingers pierced a hole through his grandson's chest, a mind-flooding pain coursed through his own body. "PCHU." Hutch's actions came to a stop. He looked up, only to find that his grandson's figure was becoming blurry for more reasons than just the tears in his eyes. Soon, Elleren's figure vanished entirely. Hutch looked down, his gaze landing on a blade as its last hints of rust fell away and drifted into the wind. Silence echoed through the battlefield. It was palpable, an almost harsh sort of silence, suffocating, even. It wrapped his hands around their throats and squeezed even as they turned purple and blue. Hutch looked up from the blade, looking into the skies. Maybe only he knew what he was looking for, but he did suddenly smile, a smile of endless relief. He slowly fell from the blade, sinking into endless darkness. Chapter 1876. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 50 seconds p.m. Chapter 1876. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1876. When? Previous chapter. Elleren watched as his grandfather slid off of his blade. He seemed to frown slightly before his brows smoothed out. By now, the way he and Hutch saw the world was simply far too different. Hutch was still bound by his duty even now, but Elleren had no loyalty to anyone outside of himself. There were many things that he couldn't be bothered to explain even to his grandfather, but now he felt lighter. Even so, Elleren was aware that his grandfather had gone easy on him. Not once did Hutch use his spatial affinity, of which he potentially had the highest on the entirety of Earth. There was a reason Hutch was probably one of the most talented raw combatants Earth had. However, in the end, he didn't have the ability to go all out against his own grandson. In fact, he chose death. Rather than being forced to choose between what he felt was right and his own flesh and blood, this felt like the much easier path. Elleren was aware of this as well, but he wasn't moved. Of course, this wasn't to say that he didn't care about his grandfather. Rather, he felt that he could defeat his grandfather whether he went all out or not. In fact, as things stood right now, he believed that he was the strongest warrior in Earth's territory. Elleren sheathed his blade, kneeling to give grandfather's side. Carefully, he turned his grandfather over. He didn't seem to care about what was happening in the surroundings at all as he looked at the peaceful smile on Hutch's face. Elleren remained silent for a long while. The blood that pooled from the wound coated his palms, sinking into the sleeves of his white tracksuit, but he didn't seem to notice. After what must have been at least 5 minutes, he reached forward and closed his grandfather's eyes and then picked him up. No one on the battlefield seemed to have the courage to stop him. They could only watch as Elleren made his way to the front of the Ascension Palace. A surge of blade force pulsed once, then twice, cutting out a perfect piece of land with edges as smooth as a mirror's surface. If one looked into it and had a keen eye, it would be possible to tell that it was exactly 6 feet deep, not a single centimeter deeper or shallower. Elleren allowed his grandfather's body to fall, but it didn't seem to follow the laws of gravity. Hutch's body fluttered like a falling snowflake, gently descending to the bottom. Elleren paused for only a moment before the hole was perfectly covered up. Unsheathing his blade, he carved out a large slab of the pearly white and gold 3/4 of his height before piercing it into the ground. With a flicker of his wrist, several beams of blade force surged forward, carving into the slab. "Here lies a loyal warrior." The words were simple and unadorned, almost casual, but encompassed Hutch's life perfectly without the slightest hint of exaggeration. The location of the grave spoke all the words that needed to be spoken. Right beneath the first step of the Ascension Palace, at the very center of this war, the very center of Earth itself. It was both a sign of respect and disrespect, both a sign of closure and a furious opening. The doors to the palace opened wide as Ellerin walked around his grandfather's grave and began to walk up the steps. With the first missing, he was forced to stretch his foot out far further before he could begin to walk up slowly and steadily. He didn't even look up to meet the gaze of Noah Fox, still looking at the ground with a calm gaze as the blade force on his machete hummed. Noah stood at the tallest height of the stairs with a serious expression, his veins pulsing. His expression was just as even as Ellerin's, but comparatively speaking, his blood was boiling. He had reacted as quickly as possible, and yet it felt as though the entirety of Earth was thrown into an upheaval. Ellerin finally looked up and Noah felt his heart skip a beat. At that moment, the calm Ellerin had a gaze that was surprisingly fiendish. His expression hadn't moved, but his eyes seemed to hold a concentrated, abyssal hell, pulsing with a furious red. Noah almost felt the need to step out of his way. Instinctually, Noah swung down his blue saber, allowing it to grow to over 10 meters long under the power of his ability index. It was as though he had seen a monster that needed to be destroyed as quickly as possible. All those with the fox name deserve death, Ellerin said lightly. Noah could hardly react. His blade passed through Ellerin as though he wasn't there at all. Clang! A machete blade rebounded against Noah's neck, leaving a white streak around what should have been a severed head. Noah's heart lurched. If it wasn't because he had sensed a threat and used his ability index to change the density and weight of his skin, that singular strike would have killed him. In fact, if it wasn't because Ellerin had underestimated him and had been too lazy to use his blade force, that one strike would have taken his life. Noah's gaze narrowed as he changed the density of his body again and allowed himself to flutter away like a leaf in the wind. Inwardly, he was more than a little shaken. When had Earth gained such a powerful seventh-dimensional existence? This should be Hutch's grandson, he knew this much. But he hadn't displayed any outstanding abilities ever since the invasion of Terrain. Just what was going on here? Just as Noah was thinking, he inexplicably found himself standing in the same place he had been before, as though he had never fluttered away to begin with. His heart leapt into his throat. How had this happened? Before he could think, Ellerin's blade was already descending with no intention of clanging against his neck again. A bright blade force swung forth with it. Chapter 1877. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 50 seconds p.m. Chapter 1877. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1877. Patience Prev. Chapter Aina sat in silent meditation, her aura in perfect balance. She took deep breaths, controlling her inhale and exhale in cycles that lasted sometimes up to several minutes. Suddenly, she opened her eyes just as there was a light knock to her and Lionel's room. Yes, you can enter. Savon came in with a worried expression on her face, one that actually caused Aina to laugh slightly. What is it? Savon was speechless. Why are you laughing? This is serious. I don't know, this is just the first time in a while I've seen anything but a smile on your face. I found it interesting. Savon blushed, seemingly understanding what Aina was getting at. But then she remembered that she wasn't entirely without ammo in this conversation. You're one to talk, I can still smell it in the air. Aina suddenly panicked. Smell? What smell? Aina's head snapped around before she froze. This time, it was her turn to blush. There was no smell, clearly Savon was just making fun of her and had won this round. Savon's laughter echoed like a silver bell. She was very used to Aina's shyness and she used to have all sorts of fun making fun of her. After the metamorphosis, she had thought that maybe all their previous interactions had all been an act, but by now, she knew that it wasn't that the Aina she had known was fake, it was only that it was just one dimension of who she was. That Aina was just as real as this one. Aina rolled her eyes and coughed slightly, trying to clear her embarrassment. Didn't you come here for something important? Look at you making fun of me, I'm innocent. Yeah, sure, Savon laughed, about as innocent as a death row inmate. Seeing that Aina was too flustered to respond, Savon graciously took her victory and remembered that she had indeed come for something quite serious. They've attacked, and according to the news, Hutch has died already by the hands of his grandson. Aina fell into silence. She knew that Hutch was quite important to Lionel, although she had never interacted much with the man personally. Even so, it was impossible for her not to feel anything simply for the fact that Lionel had always seen him as a mentor. That said, before he had left, Lionel had known that this was a distinct possibility. No parent wanted to end their child's life, and there was definitely no grandparent who wanted their grandchild's life. However, Hutch had been unlucky in two ways. He had not only outlived his children, but he was faced with trouble of standing in opposition to his grandson. It was simply impossible for him to survive both, so even without being there, Lionel knew that Hutch would choose to die rather than make such a voice. It didn't matter to him that Lionel had warned him, it didn't matter to him that there was a path to survive. Hutch had always felt that this era had passed him by. Despite his talent, he never really felt the same passion he had in his youth, and maybe that was because he had simply lost too much. Even so, regardless of whether this was his choice or not, Aina knew that Lionel would take it quite hard. What should we do? Savon asked. Aina took a deep breath and exhaled. Nothing. Now isn't the time yet. Savon's gaze flickered. Even with the capital being burned down? Aina shook her head and smiled bitterly. She couldn't repeat what Lionel had said before he left. Her thoughts flashed and she remembered that annoying smirk on his face. Let that old man sweat a bit, is what he had said. That man was really too much. This was an existential crisis, but he could only see his beef with his own grandfather. Of course, Aina knew the real Lionel. More likely than not, it was something that he was too lazy to explain. If he could stop the unnecessary deaths, he would, but he wasn't some sort of god. There was a limit to what he could predict and prepare for. At the same time, there was definitely something tying Emperor Fox's hands, likely the same thing tying down the four great families. It didn't make sense if only one side faced restrictions while the other side didn't. If Emperor Fox could wave a hand and deal with everything, he would have. As such, there was a certain delicate approach that was necessary. All right, in that case, well, be on standby, Savon nodded. She turned to leave but hesitated for a moment. If you need anything, I'm here to talk. Savon didn't say anything else as she left. She knew quite well that of them all, the one having the most trouble waiting patiently for the right time was Aina herself. There was nothing she wanted more than to unleash unholy hell on the Brazingers and their allies, but right now, she had to exercise patience. In that case, this was the only option. Aina smiled lightly as Savon left. Though she didn't say anything more either, the appreciation was clear in her eyes. Soon she would make that family pay in blood for what they had done to her family, her mother. Lionel clashed against an enemy spear, and slipped to the side. He activated Knight's charge and slid past the enemy's left. With a twirl of his spear, the heavy butt of the lance spear smashed into the Rapak's shoulder blade, throwing it off balance and causing its tail swing to miss and soar over Lionel's head. Swift, Lionel said softly. His feet pivoted and the tip of his lance spear trembled, not feeling nearly as heavy as it once did. Bang! 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 He pierced through space through 3 locations. At the same time, time layered as well, staking 3 strikes at each one of the 3 locations and piercing right through the Rapak's vital points. The enemy Rapak slowly fell to the ground, unable to battle even as Lionel snatched away his spear, exhaling a slow breath. Chapter 1878. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 50 seconds p.m. Chapter 1878. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1878 Aerial Prev Chapter Battle. The number of territories that Lionel had already soared over 400 and the gap between him and others seemed to only be growing. These days, when he came across others, it would be lucky if they had 20 territories to their name, let alone hundreds like he did. But there was an unfortunate drawback to having so much more territory than anyone else, and that was that he was often forced into battles before he had time to rest or even choose his own targets. With the size of his territory, he was connected across far too many locations. Even if one wasn't targeting him on purpose, accidentally strolling into his region was far too easy. If it wasn't for the fact that a territory couldn't be targeted by more than one person at once, he would have definitely suffered greatly by now. Lionel was about to take a step out of his territory when the force field solidified. He shook his head and knew that someone else had stepped forward to challenge him. With a sign, he turned and burst toward a particular direction, wanting to deal with this person as quickly as possible. Enul, the nomad race young man with 2 arms and 6 hands, walked around with a hint of frown on his face. He felt that something was off about his surroundings, but he couldn't quite understand what it was. It was like the territories were being suffocated by something, but it wasn't immediately obvious what it was. His first assumption was that it was Idrim. Usually, the tribulation would do certain things to force battle and force the geniuses to face off against one another. For example, the fact that you couldn't absorb the strength of a defeated enemy was a conscious choice rather than a bug. This was to force the geniuses to battle as much as possible, as often as possible, or else you'd lag far behind your peers by the time you came across one of them, and even if by some miracle, you managed to defeat them, that strength would vanish forever. This wasn't the only thing in this vein either. Sometimes treasure territories where there would be the reward of a spear or armor or technique at the end would appear in between 2 territories to incentivize battle. Or, sometimes a powerful beast territory would appear, and by claiming it, one could spawn new beasts ahead of time without having to cross into a new grade. However, the occurrences of such things were suspiciously low during this round, almost as though the tribulation was content with the level of activity. But why was it that Enul felt that this was all nonsense? He had hardly run into any challenge at all, and he had only run into a single treasure territory, whereas by now he should have run into at least 3. Enul shook his head. At the same time, several other geniuses were feeling the same exact way. Among them, there was Pyrrhina of the dwarven race, or more specifically, since she was a woman, she was a pixie. Just like the members of the other races, she had her own advantages. Namely, thanks to her wings, she was able to get a landscape of the surroundings that everyone else couldn't, and she could find her targets far quicker than most. As such, much like Lionel, she cleared zone much faster than most others, and by now, she had already crossed the silver grade. As a genius of the dwarven race, she had felt the same problem Enul had. Compared to the descriptions of her family's record, this was much different than what she had expected, too different. Something felt off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Suddenly, her gaze sharpened and her gaze landed on a figure shuttling through the forest below with great speed. Her wings fluttered once and she rose higher into the air, choosing caution first. Although she was an absolute genius of her race, her first instinct was still caution. The dwarven race was one of the weaker races right there with humans, they just used their ingenuity to make up for it. Long before she was a genius, she was a pixie. However, despite her caution, the young man below snapped his gaze upward, seeing her instantly. His gaze is that sharp. How is that possible? Is he a special demon race? Pyrrhina was caught off guard. She thought she was high enough and far enough away to not be spotted instantly. Down below, Lionel's gaze narrowed. He had defeated several dwarven race members by now, but none of them could fly that high. Flight wasn't a simple thing, especially in a world of force like this one. Even if you had wings, there were limitations. Even in a third-dimensional world, a bird could soar into the skies indefinitely. The fact that this woman could fly so high definitely meant that she was a genius. That should mean she has a lot of territories. Lionel's gaze flashed and he suddenly tilted his lance spear upward. Knight's charge. Under Pyrrhina's astonished gaze, Lionel suddenly drew a line through the skies, charging straight through the air and appearing level with her in the blink of an eye. Lionel thrust his lance spear out, a vicious momentum being carried behind its devastating weight. Although she was caught off guard, Pyrrhina still reacted quickly, flapping her wings just once and angling her body to the side. At the same time, she pierced out with her own spear, aiming for the side of Lionel's in a parrying action. She had seen through Lionel's weakness in an instant. Jumping into the skies like this made him a sitting duck. She only had to dodge once and then he would become nothing more than her plaything. However, to Purina's astonishment, Lionel only muttered under his breath once and a barrier radiated out from him, rippling out and slowing her spear by half. But what was maybe even more shocking was that her movement in the air also slowed a measure. A parry required precise timing. With it thrown off like this, she missed, her spear hitting nothing but air. Lionel used the lingering momentum of Knight's charge to glide by Purina and enter the air space just above her. With a pivot of his hips and a swing of his spear, just as his upward momentum came to an end, he viciously attacked her back, swinging with all his might. Bang! Purina froze for a moment as though the time frame of the blade connecting with her was extended into infinity. Instantly she knew that one of her wings had been crippled. Boom! The sound barrier shattered as she sped toward the ground like a streaking bullet. Chapter 1879. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 1879. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1879. Freely Prev. Chapter. Lionel began to rapidly descend from the air, his speed picking up with every passing moment. The harsh winds blew against his white fur coat, threatening to blow his hood bad entirely. And yet, he aimed his lance spear forward toward the still-growing crater in the ground and did something even more insane. Knight's charge. Lionel drew a line diagonally and down through the skies, accelerating his downward momentum and appearing above the crater in the blink of an eye. He moved so fast that the crater below hadn't even begun to settle by the time he swung again with a fierce momentum. Purina was still in a daze, having suffered a crippled wing just an instant later, all while having her ribs shattered and all the air knocked out from her lungs. If not for a protective treasure she had protecting her, that single strike might have very well ended her life. Even in comparison to humans, the bones of the dwarven race were incredibly fragile and most hollow. This was why they could fly with such small and weak wings to begin with, and also why their bodies were so much shorter than that of other races. If they grew too large, they would collapse under their own weight. That kind of harsh blunt damage was the kind Purina feared most, and yet another barrage was already coming. Purina grit her teeth watching Lionel descend like a blazing meteor. Her green irises flickered once as though to memorize his face before her one good wing flapped as hard as it could. Her body was flung up and out toward her left, just barely streaking by as Lionel collided with the ground. Boom! Purina hoped that Lionel had bit off more than he could chew. Falling to the ground with that kind of speed without something to break his fall should have at least jarred him. Until now, Purina hadn't even realized that Lionel was a human because she didn't have the time to pay attention to such things. To her, he must have been from a sturdy race, which was why he dared to do such a thing. But so long as he missed her, he would have to deal with the impact all on his own. To her shock, though, that weird blue ripple formed again, slowing Lionel's fall just when it seemed that he would cause himself devastating injury. Even so, half of that impact strength should have been enough to harm him severely, or so Purina thought. Unfortunately for her, she was measuring Lionel by the standards of her current body and upscaling it to a race with stronger bones than her own. This seemed logical to her because she didn't think anyone could clear territories faster than she could. But she was wrong. Not only had Lionel cleared far more, his body was far sturdier as a result. He had consumed easily what amounted to be at least 50% more beast crystals than the person in second place currently. Comparing her current body to his own was asking to be humiliated. Purina spiraled into the ground with a somewhat helpless expression as she watched Lionel spring up as though nothing had happened, shooting toward her direction with yet another knight's charge. Inwardly, she was exasperated. Who had allowed this human to gain a weapon with such an ability attached to it? Wait, human. Purina's eyes widened as Lionel's spear descended. Wait. Wait. I have something useful for you. Don't kill me. The dwarven race didn't have the same culture of valiance that the other races did. They placed survival first and foremost, and they sought it at any cost. Another genius might have felt too prideful to beg, but Pyrrhina felt that in the face of someone obviously stronger than you, such pride was only useful in getting you killed faster. Lionel didn't originally have the intention of killing Pyrrhina to begin with. He had killed a few geniuses during these tribulations, but those were either people who had pissed him off or didn't know how to give in. He didn't have the time to coddle everyone. His spear came to a stop just above Pyrrhina's head. Pyrrhina, who had closed her eyes, slowly opened them again and sighed a breath of relief. However, she panicked again when she saw that Lionel was reaching for her spear. Wait! Lionel frowned, looking to raise his spear again. What was this woman trying to pull here, exactly? He didn't have the patience for this. Also, he could tell that her power wasn't bad, and given her flight advantage, she should have cleared quite a number of territories. Lionel didn't understand why he should spare such a person. Plus, if he spared her, how would they deal with this? The territory barriers wouldn't open up again until one of them was dealt with. Lionel had already tested this. If it could, he might not have backtracked to deal with her first. By now, Lionel was getting a bit antsy. He didn't know that everyone was experiencing a shortage of treasure territories due to his actions, so he felt the fact that he only had 2 silver-grade treasures would come back to bite him eventually. All this time, aside from his stronger power and speed, his greatest advantage was that his weapon was better than everyone else's. But now the best he ran into all had silver-grade spears. If he wanted to maintain his advantage, he needed something better, which was why he was pushing so hard to leave his territory. But his territory was so large and had so many entry points that he couldn't even do that without receiving challenge after challenge, so he was already frustrated. If Pyrrhina tested his patience, she would just have to join the short list of those he had killed in this tribulation. Don't. I have a treasure that can allow one of us to exit a territory unimpeded. It's useful to you, no? If I stay here, no one can enter your territory because it will be in an active state, but you can move freely. Chapter 1880. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 1880. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1880. Even so. Previous chapter. Lionel paused, his gaze flickering. This sounded like a top-class treasure, but even without his usual thinking speed, he could already see several drawbacks to it. For one, even if you can leave your territory, just like Pyrrhina said, it would still be in an active state. As such, there would be a lot of things you couldn't do, like fusing new territories into it or beginning to spawn newer and more powerful beasts. This treasure was probably best used as an escape measure to leave the territories of others if you accidentally ran into an opponent far more powerful than yourself. If you used it to escape your own territory, you would always have to come back to it eventually and deal with the enemy you left behind. So, unless you found a powerful treasure on the outside, the end result would be the same. However, considering how rare those were, Lionel wouldn't hold his breath. This was the main problem. If Lionel used Pyrrhina to block off entry to his territory, it would only be useful for so long. By the time he got to the gold grade, not only would he not be able to fuse his territories, but he would also be caught up to by the others due to an inability to spawn beasts. "I'm not interested," Lionel said coldly. "You have 2 choices. Obediently hand over your spear and you keep your life, or don't and I kill you and take your spear anyway." Pyrrhina sighed when she heard this. She had tried. But at least she wouldn't lose her life. She was hoping to hit the gold grade, but silver wasn't terrible either. It was a slight disappointment, but not devastating. With a flick of her wrist, she sent her spear over to Lionel, but even as she faded away, nursing her injuries, she burned Lionel's face into her mind. Lionel's gaze narrowed slightly. He could tell that while Pyrrhina's outward showing was demure and flexible, her heart burned with a similar fire as all the others. She was an interesting character. Clearly she could lay down her pride, but she had values she wouldn't compromise. When she vanished, an orb and a hidden armor was left behind. Lionel stripped down and placed the hidden armor under everything and then took the orb, tossing it in his palm. This should be the treasure that Pririna was talking about. Lionel didn't care much for it, though. He didn't really have any intention of running from a battle, and he didn't think there was anyone who could make him do it either. But there was no need to throw away decent enough treasure. Suddenly, Lionel's gaze flickered. She lied. Pririna probably didn't expect Lionel to have the skill to tell. Outside of the person who had claimed the treasure, the true function of a treasure wouldn't magically download its uses into your mind. When Lionel had taken Alarina's armor, he had to learn how to use it himself, and the same was the case for this orb. After looking at it and checking into his force arts, Lionel realized that this orb's ability wasn't as simple as Pririna made it out to be. In fact, it was of the gold grade and it allowed you to freely change the state of your territory. Lionel realized that if he had taken Pririna up on her offer and left, she could have used his orb to claim his territory for herself and then rushed away to a new territory while he was away. By the time he came back, he would find himself locked out of his own territory. Of course, to pull that off, Pririna would have to give up the orb and let Lionel control, but who knew what other tricks she had to deal with that. Lionel looked down at the flexible armor he had put on without thinking much and realized that it too had an ability. What a tricky little woman. I actually thought about accepting her offer too, there were just too many drawbacks. The flexible armor's defense wasn't great, but its ability was very useful. It allowed you to tether a home location onto an object and have it appear there with a thought. Usually, this would be most useful in helping yourself to avoid danger, but if Pririna had tethered it to the orb instead, she wouldn't have to risk ever losing it to Lionel. She would get the territory, keep her life, and be a large way to the gold grade. Lionel smiled and shook his head. He had a feeling that he would meet this tricky woman again. But next time, he would have his ability index. He really wanted to see what tricks she would have for him then. Lionel tossed the orb and caught it. With these two treasures, the rest of this will be even easier. I should hit gold grade by the end of the day. With a thought, Lionel turned his territory into an active one, barring anyone from entering as he rushed out. Finally, he could pick his own target. The turmoil in Earth's territory only seemed to be growing. The dichotomy between regions of chaos and regions of absolute silence was palpable. From space above, it almost looked like different worlds were colliding. On one side there was lush greenery and endless expanses of nature, and on the other there were acres of raging fire and plumes of smoke that fought against the white clouds in the sky. But oddly enough, after the initial huge swing in the favor of the rebels and the four great family geniuses, nothing happened. Well, maybe this wasn't entirely accurate as a descriptor, it was more appropriate to say that things entered a stalemate. Prince Noah Fox was beaten back by Ellerin, almost losing his life several times. However, after realizing that he was no match for Hutch's grandson, Jessica Scarlet and the young heir of the Dove family appeared to support him, causing the battle to become a 3 versus 1 with no clear victor in sight. However, what was especially odd was that Ellerin didn't seem to be pushing for victory. It was then that the geniuses of the four great families descended onto the capital and everything seemed to change. In the skies, King Arthur stood across from Adrin. He had just failed to stop the others from returning to Earth and now he was forced to face off against a tough enemy. He shook his head inwardly, looking toward Earth. He felt that his decision was correct, but even so, he didn't feel that Earth had anything capable of withstanding those monsters, at least not without Lionel here. Chapter 1881. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 1881. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1881. He is? Previous chapter, you are King Arthur? Adrin asked with a dark expression. Arthur frowned, not quite understanding the hostility. After all, it was Adrin leading a rebellion, not him. Unless he was made about the death of that blondie from earlier? But he doubted that the relationship between the four families was that close. They were more tied by benefits than relationships, at least that was the feeling he got from his years of experience. How could Arthur know that the reason Adrin was unhappy was because the Camelot zone was the very one his sister had almost lost her life in? On top of that, it was the zone that had led little Nana to having such a codependency on Lionel. Sometimes, Adrin wondered who the true elder brother was between the two of them. Of course, Adrin wasn't petty enough to hate Lionel for this. After all, he had returned the favor back then, although Lionel didn't quite need it. That said, that didn't mean he forgave everyone else that was involved. The secrets of what happened back then in the Camelot zone were still relatively unknown. It was hard to tell who had interfered and almost turned it into a unique zone. Even Lionel, who had been targeted as a result of it, wasn't 100% certain of who had acted back then. With that perspective, Adrin didn't have enough animosity toward the Pendragon family to go out of his way to seek them, but now that he was here and bound by duty, it made it convenient. Without answering to Arthur's curiosities, Adrin directly attacked, placing the former on his back foot. Arthur's expression darkened. Ever since he had come into his own with these odd new abilities, he had very rarely met anyone who was his match. In fact, other than when battling his daughter, everything else was far too simple. Unfortunately, it seemed that his work was cut out for him this time. He had only attacked once, but everything seemed to deflect off of those transparent scales that coated Adrin's body. Luckily, they weren't completely out of luck. While Arthur was blocked by Adrin, there were other powerhouses of Camelot more than prepared to make a move. At that moment, Avalon made its first large movements ever since the war over a decade ago. Mordred led a strong troop below, storming into the capital. At first, they were all cautious. With a rebellion like this, maybe one of the biggest issues was actually telling who was friend and who was foe. Mordred hadn't even ruled out the possibility that there might be some enemies hidden within Camelot as well. It was impossible to tell. However, after the rust was kicked off and clear lines were drawn, Mordred's wand danced across the air almost as though she was performing an elegant sword dance. With her as the vanguard and her vicious demon army to her back, they tore a path to the center of the battlefield, trying to effect as much change as they could. Mordred had never felt more powerful. In the past, she would have to patiently accumulate dark force for her spells, even to the point where she felt far more comfortable in the world of demons as opposed to the land where she was born. But after awakening to Shadow Sovereign as her ability index, it felt like she had an entire world of dark force to tap into whenever she wanted. Curses flooded the air, debuffing enemies. Lances, arrows and javelins filled the air, wafting a dense black fog as they manifested from spinning magic circles. At the same time, the land seemed to be slowly being corrupted step by step. Mordred's demons suddenly shot out from behind her, raising shields and heavy weapons as they cleared the path forward. As the tides of the battle slowly turned, Mordred sighed inwardly. She knew that the other shoe was going to drop soon, mostly because Lionel had made it obvious that it would. If this was enough, he wouldn't have emphasized caution so much at this point. Through the carnage of the battle, up ahead toward the palace that seemed to be about to be burnt down to the ground, the clash of Ellerin and Jessica, Tyrion and Noah entered her sights. She couldn't help but frown when she saw the kind of power Ellerin had. Suddenly, her head turned in a different direction. "There's the other shoe," Mordred mumbled in her mind. Mordred looked toward a descending group of youths with a solemn expression. Namely, she was almost entirely focused on just one young lady. She looked almost adorable despite the fact she should have been well into her 30s by this point. She had bob-cut blue hair and bangs just barely short enough to stay out of her eyes. Her eyes were large and she blinked continuously as though she was still fascinated by the world around her. But she was powerful. Almost too powerful. The moment she touched the ground, in the surrounding near-kilometer distance, almost everyone froze. This wasn't because of a sudden sweeping cold, or even out of fear. It was a raw, unbridled power of restriction that the young woman didn't even seem to activate consciously. If she was in range of that, Mordred wasn't even sure if she could break free, let alone battle against it. The young woman didn't even have to raise a finger. The moment she descended, the few that had followed after her burst into action, cutting down all enemies in sight. In what felt like no more than a few seconds, a tenth of the army was rendered entirely useless. If Mordred had made small pushes to better their situation, the appearance of this individual had completely swung the tide. However, just as Mordred was about to grit her teeth, feeling that she was probably the only one who could stop what was happening right now, a man appeared before the ground out of nowhere. He wore a pair of clear glasses, his dressing immaculate as not a single fabric was out of place. He clasped his hands behind his back and the innocent expression of the young woman seemed to be colored with confusion for a moment. For some reason, she couldn't bind this man as casually as the others. There was a man the people of Earth too often forgot, the man who had the official position of heir to the Ascension Empire, Princess Eleanor's elder brother, Lionel Morales' uncle, and Noah Fawkes' father. Galeran Fawkes. Chapter 1882. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 1882. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1882. Children Prev Chapter. The rampage of the Brazingers, Adernas, Critus and Lavis came to a halt before this man. Even so, much like Mordred, he only had eyes for little Nana who stood right before him. He didn't even spare a glance toward his son who was currently fighting for his life. The four great families are not welcome here, Galeran said lightly. I don't have a passion for killing children, so don't force my hand. Raffer's gaze narrowed. He didn't dare to say anything, he knew his limits quite well. The gap between the sixth dimension and seventh was already something that even the greatest talent had a hard time bridging, let alone the gap between the sixth dimension and a great talent of the seventh dimension like this man. Nana, this man will have to be left up to you, a young man of the Aderna family said. Nana nodded, but didn't make a move immediately. Where is Lionel? I want to talk to him. Galeran's expression was just the same, but he found this line of questioning to be interesting. My nephew has more important matters to deal with. Nephew? You are Lionel's uncle? I am, Galeran replied plainly. Nana hesitated. She didn't want to fight Lionel's uncle. Seeing this scene, the others were exasperated, but without Adrin here, no one dared to order this little powerhouse around with impunity. Plus, although Nana was a little naive, she wasn't a fool, she had the capability of understanding what was at stake just like the rest of them could. Nana bit her lips. Do you know when he will be back? That I do not know. Galeran didn't actually know where Lionel was, the latter had only come by a few weeks ago to inform them of some things before leaving. A lot like his father, his nephew refused to explain anything in clear terms. The two liked to butt heads, but they were practically the same person. Then, excuse me. Nana suddenly moved. Although her body had been entirely relaxed a moment ago, her explosive speed was enough to leave cold shivers running down the spine of the spectators. Her delicate palm crashed through the air with more speed than the wind trying to move around it could muster, causing the pressure to accumulate along her skin with an explosive might. Galeran, though, the one facing this palm strike, didn't seem to be moved in the slightest. His tidy hair fluttered and his clothing rippled somewhat. Even before the strike landed, he actually took the time to smooth out those wrinkles before he looked up and pushed his hand forward slowly as though he was using it as a knife to cut into a soft layer of cake. Nana's large blue eyes blinked. She instinctually reacted to the danger thrumming in her heart, and a layer of transparent blue scaled immediately coated her palm, wrist, and up the length of her forearm. The members of the Aderna family who saw this couldn't help but feel their hearts skip a beat. Nana almost never used her lineage factor. Nana had something that could only be described as innate battle sense, something that usually only manifested in Brazingers. Her ability to deploy her power was perfect, and she never used more strength than was necessary, never. Due to her strength, she would often still have piles of trump cards left unused after a battle. For her to bring out something so core to her greatest power before her first strike even landed said a lot about her opponent. Bang! Galeran's slow hand knife caused Nana to take 3 heavy steps backward. She looked toward her hand as though she was a hint of surprise. She hadn't felt her body trembling like this after an exchange in a very long time. She wasn't even entirely sure of what had just happened. Galeran didn't seem to have used any force, and unlike Eleron's strikes which only seemed to be slow, Galeron's strike truly was so. Attack speed was higher than movement speed for obvious reasons, and yet it had taken Galeron the entire length of Nana's run toward him to complete his strike. Without speed, there could be no power. This was simple logic. The only way for something to be both powerful and slow was for it to be heavy. However, Galeron lacked in both aspects. His body was as light as a feather, that much Nana was certain of. On top of that, his strike was slow. Nothing seemed to make any sense. "This is the last opportunity one will give you," Galeron said softly. "I don't like to bully children, so please leave." A member of the Critus family couldn't seem to take it anymore, their green hair whipping about wildly as they pointed a finger toward Galeron. "You say that, and yet didn't you wipe out all 4 of our families? How many innocent children were among that number? Don't bullshit us." Galeron's expression remained unchanged. "Those were not actions taken by me. In addition, speaking of morality in war is a bit foolish, do you not think?" Hearing Galeron say this, the others were speechless. Wasn't he the one who brought up morality first by saying he didn't want to kill children? Which was it, exactly? "I don't see this as a war, I see this as a lashing out by children who are looking to impress their parents." Galeron's gaze shifted and landed on Raffer. In that moment, Raffer shivered from head to toe. Why did it feel like he was completely seen through in that instant? This attack is disorganized, it's clearly sporadic, and it's a shame that the powers that have taken your side can't see that, or maybe they do and have no choice but to follow through anyway because they've received too many benefits from you. But what I can say is that there is only one way this ends for you, and that's in a complete and utter loss. It was clear that compared to his father and even his own son, the seemingly stoic Galeron was far more talkative. "Oh? Is that so?" Raffer forced himself to regain his composure and sneered. "This runs far deeper than you think it does. Come out." Raffer roared. "Is that right?" Galeron pushed his glasses up. "You're calling Fourth Minister Maya, the former Secretary Marquisette Maya, is that right?" Raffer froze. In fact, Maya, who was prepared to make her move, also froze at that moment. Chapter 1883. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 1883. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1883. Maya and Silaprev. Chapter Galeron was unmoved by Raffer's surprise, but this wasn't because he had known for a very long time, it was instead because he had learned of the oddity himself via Lionel not too long ago. The former Secretary Marquisette Maya, now turned Imperial Minister, was a very odd story, not because it was overly complex, but because of how covert and secretive it had been. If not for a small mistake Maya had made almost 3 decades ago now, this matter may very well have been entirely devastating. The first time Lionel met Maya she actually had an entirely different look and he almost lost his life at the hands of her schemes. Back then, she had been a captain of the Slayer Legion and his interactions with her could only be said to have been far from pleasant. The 2 women, or rather 2 identities, couldn't have been further from one another. One was a leader of the rebels, and the other was a high official for the Empire. One was obese and quite ugly, while the other was a voluptuous, mature beauty who turned heads just by walking down the street. The 2 didn't seem to have any connection with one another and their stories only seemed to diverge more and more as the years went on. The captain of the Slayer Legion identity, Captain Cell, slowly worked her way up the ranks, becoming a prominent figure in the Slayer Legion, a fact that likely resulted in the many traitors that had appeared today. On the other side, the Secretary Marquisette identity had worked her way into the Royal Blue Fort, becoming the new first wife of Governor Duke Luem and birthing his child. The last time Lionel had even thought of this woman, it was for the sake of laughing at the plight of Miles Luem. Back then, it was Miles and Simeon who had acted together to launch bombs after Lionel and his attempt to escape from the fort. That had led to Aina being severely injured and the pair of lovebirds being separated for a time. Due to that event, Miles had been scapegoated by his father who had been in the capital at the time, and the child Governor Duke Luem sired with Maya became the new heir to the Governor Duke family. This felt like a satisfying conclusion to the story, and it would have been as such had Maya not had a second identity. But between then and now, she had climbed from Secretary Marquisette, to wife of Governor Duke, to Imperial Minister. What was especially odd about this was that Imperial Minister was a higher status than Secretary Marquisette, but this wasn't necessarily the case for the title of Governor Duke. However, rather than using her child to leverage a Governor Duke position, Maya had chosen to come to the heart of the capital instead, sinking her claws into the heart of both the Slayer Legion and the capital. This woman was very clearly smart, conniving, and exceptionally patient, having laid down her plans for decades. So what had exposed her in the end? It was something quite simple, actually. Her choice in perfume. Back then, Lionel had felt that Captain Sella's fragrance was familiar, but his memory had been far weaker during that time. It was only after he joined Valiant Heart Mountain and replaced his soul force with Dream Force did his memory become sharp to the point of even remembering his time spent as a baby in his mother's arms. After that, all of Lionel's memories were retroactively etched into his mind like stone, quite nearly infallible. Of course, back then, he still hadn't made the connection immediately. While remembering his mother was important to him, knowing the fragrance of a random woman was meaningless to him. However, while Lionel was preparing for this war, he would obviously pool together all of the knowledge he had. In addition, as a prince of the empire, he had access to all of the information he could ever want to know about the various nobles and the Slayer Legion, on top of whatever the etching metal organization could gather up. The final nail in the coffin was Maya's ability index. It was labeled quite simply, allowing her to maintain her youth. When Lionel first met her, she was a woman well into her twilight years, and yet she looked like a 20-year-old bombshell just entering her prime. This seemed to check out, but then Lionel's dreamscape sparked. What other abilities could allow a person to appear much younger than they were? When one framed it that way, the answer almost seemed far too obvious. Obviously, if a person could shape-shift, wouldn't making a change as simple as age be as easy as breathing? In addition, choosing to outwardly display your ability index in that way would make people think you were far more limited than you truly were. It was almost too easy for Maya to get away with this. Back when the metamorphosis first descended, Earth's ability to detect ability indexes was incredibly crude. It could only classify Lionel's ability index as an S-grade sensory type ability. As for Aina, it classified hers as an S-grade healing type ability. Of course it would be too vague to expose Maya. On top of that, if exposing an enemy's ability index was so easy, then so many in the dimensional verse wouldn't hold their ability index out as a trump card. The details of one's ability index was almost always a secret one would hold close to their chests. Maya would have never thought that her years of diligent planning would be exposed by something so simple. Even now, after Galerin had spoken, she had no idea what had exposed her. Even so, there was nothing she could do but step out slowly. Since it had come to this point, there was no time for more preparation, there was only the final step remaining. Maya stepped down from the sky expressionlessly, descending as though a deity. To her back, two very young men followed. While many on the battlefield only looked like they were in the 20s but were really much older, both of these young men truly were that young. With a slight flicker of light, all three changed. And all three became members of the Cloud race. Chapter 1884. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 1884. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1884. Killprev chapter. As though this transformation had triggered a change, several that stood in the mess of the battlefield stood to their full height. With a slight shimmer, one after another, Cloud race members began to appear. At first, there were just the three in the skies. But very quickly, this number began to jump, seemingly doubling every few seconds. In just a few moments, it had gone from a battle of humans to an assault of the Cloud race. No matter where one looked, another would appear. Very quickly, those that remained very much human began to warily look around, wondering just who would turn next and trying to avoid being stabbed in the back. Mordred's expression suddenly flickered and her figure vanished into the void, swirling into a rotating black hole of dense fog before appearing several meters away. She looked toward where she had just been standing with an ugly expression. Right there, a halberd that would have pierced through her back thrust through the air, a violently rotating wind still circling around it. The attack itself wasn't a big deal, but it was who was on the other end of it that left Mordred feeling her heart plummet. The demons had long since become her family. Seeing her right-hand men turn into members of the cloud race one after another left a lump in her throat. She knew for certain that the only reason this could happen was because those she had called brother had long since died. Mordred's eyes turned red as she gripped her wand tight, her fair and slender fingers trembling. Maya touched down from the skies, her cloud figure fluttering in the wind. Her white dress danced along with it, wafting a familiar and delicate fragrance into the air. Even if you know, it no longer matters. You've allowed me far too much time, Maya said lightly. Galerin didn't say anything to Maya. Instead, he looked toward Nana and the others. Pairing yourselves with the cloud race is a bit pathetic, don't you think? Raffer, who had recovered when he realized knowing or not didn't make much of a difference, sneered. You think we owe you something because you call yourselves human? As far as I'm concerned, we're not even of the same race. The disdain Raffer had in his heart for the people of Earth, and maybe even just the humans of the human domain in general, was palpable. Surprisingly, though, when Galerin heard this, he smiled for the first time. Interesting you say that, because I doubt the highest echelon of your Brazinger family think you to be of the same race as them either, let alone of the same family. Those who build their status off of foolish ideals are bound to be swallowed whole by such ideals in the future. Raffer's face paled, his pupils trembling. The words were simple, and yet they seemed to pierce his very soul. Galerin turned from Raffer and sized up Maya before opening his mouth slightly. What is your relationship with Guerreros? Maya's gaze narrowed when she heard the question. Oh, you might not know him by that name. I mean the member of your race who targeted the chaotic water sector. Maya's pupils constricted into pinholes. Seems like you don't know, a pity. Galerin said lightly. What happened to Joram? Is that his name? Galerin asked, seemingly not expecting an answer. Well, I assume by now his days aren't too good after being caught by Shield Cross stars. Maya's gaze seemed to tremble again. Are these your sons? Galerin continued without a care for Maya's reaction. I assume that you had real children just for the chance to replace them with full-fledged members of your race. Your plans run quite deep, and are even crueler than they are meticulous. Maya slowly regained her composure, but didn't seem to have the intention of replying directly. Even so, your ending won't be much different from Joram, Galerin spoke calmly and evenly just as a loud boom echoed across the horizon. Boom! At that moment, an enormous flagship appeared in the skies. However, rather than descending, it began to fuse into what was once an invisible network of force arts, the very same force arts that had caught the Brazingers earlier. The force art that covered the entire planet solidified all at once, and a brilliant violet-gold array of complex gears, runes and mechanisms replaced the white clouds and blue skies above. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to check to know that even if tried now, she would have no ability to escape this battle. It was either she won, or she died here. The flagship opened and a young woman appeared at the helm. In her small hands a battle axe with a polearm over 2 meters long angled forward, its dual blades so large that they curved for over 6 feet from tip to tip. Sparks of black lightning and dense crimson fog hung around her, an oppressive aura suffocating everything. One after another, powerful warriors appeared from her back, leaping off the side of the flagship and falling like streaking meteors. Bang! The earth rose like a tide, rippling out in all directions. High in the skies, Aina still stood at the helm of the flagship, unmoving. She took deep breaths, her gaze slowly landing on the Brazingers below. Veins pulsed through her body, her heart beating with the heaviness of a mountain. For some reason, when they saw this gaze, they felt themselves shiver. Those piercing golden eyes wanting for nothing more than murder. Kill. Aina said lightly, lifting her battle axe and slamming the butt of its polearm into the ground. At that moment, the force art rippled and barriers descended one by one. In that moment, Earth was divided into 11 sections, the capital, 9 provinces, and the vast ocean, in addition to being completely isolated from the outside world. Now, it was impossible to seek reinforcements. Aina took a step and began to freefall from the skies above, her speed becoming faster and faster without her giving the slightest intention to stop. Boom! Chapter 1885. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 52 seconds p.m. Chapter 1885. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1885. Quite well. Previous chapter. Tsunami-like tides of earth rushed in all directions. Aina's feet stabilized, her knees hardly bending beneath the impact. Wild surges of oppressive might pressed down, the suffocating scent of blood pervading the air. Despite the fact there were several seventh-dimensional experts around her, none could seem to take their eyes off of the crimson-armored Valkyrie in the center of them all. It almost didn't seem right for such a young face to carry such fury and animosity. Even without a hint of fire force, the temperature rose by several degrees every second, only becoming more savage as Aina walked forward. All of a sudden, Aina's figure vanished. When she appeared again, the heads of what must have been at least a dozen Cloud Race members flew into the air. No, it was less accurate to say that she had appeared and more accurate to say that a scythe-like blade of axe force had. Her own movements felt far too fast to track. One could only seem to follow her by watching the fall of enemies and blinding blades of crimson. Just a moment ago, the fear and oppression of the Cloud Race had been so heavy. Just with a single look, these veterans of battle could tell just how much strength these members of another race had. However, before that fear could even solidify, their massacre had become. Aina didn't seem to know fatigue, and for a moment, it truly felt like she was the only battling at all. Tides of blood rose into the air, forming dozens of blood-red roses that ground their way through the battlefield with impunity. It seemed the more Aina killed, the more vicious her killing methods became. The others hadn't even gotten a chance to act yet, but hundreds had already fallen beneath her blade. Her hair fluttered in the air, a wild crimson aura forming around her body piercing into the skies above. The Brazingers in the distance couldn't help but tremble. This level of the Berserk war god lineage factor was something they had only seen in a very small number of their kind. They couldn't understand how this half-blood could reach it. Maya's expression changed as well. She hadn't wanted to step in immediately to allow her Cloud Race to establish their dominance, but this little girl was very clearly a top-tier genius. The effect she had wanted was immediately suffocated. She took a step forward, prepared to end it, but her gaze narrowed as she felt a pair of eyes land on her. "It can't be that you want to act against my little niece-in-law, right?" Galarin asked lightly. Maya sneered. "This is the first time I've met such arrogant humans. In the cloud domain, the likes of you could only obediently spend their lives in chains, bound like dogs and destined to serve others for the whole of their existence. Do you think you have the right to speak to me this way?" Maya raised her hand as though she was going to act anyway, but one of the young men by her side grabbed her forearm. "You don't need to step in personally for something like this, Mother. Arden is more than enough." The second young man's lip twitched. This older brother of his was so lazy. He wanted to pretend to be cool, and yet he was placing the task on his shoulders instead. It didn't matter much to him, though. He was beginning to feel a bit antsy regardless. Arden flickered and vanished without a word, executing the unique movement technique of the Cloud Race. He became completely amorphous, weaving through the battlefield in a cloud of gray, white and gold. Hey! The queen is on a roll right now. Not just any nobody can attack her. Bang! A figure seemed to appear from nowhere, his shadow forming a crane-like posture as he kicked out. Arden almost couldn't react in time to a foot nearly connecting with his face. Almost immediately, Arden cancelled his movement technique and crossed his arms over his face. Arden's pupils constricted when he felt the force of the kick. He took several steps backward, nearly losing his balance as a tall man with horrible posture landed before him. Hephaestus stood with a sharp-toothed grin. "If you don't get out of my way, dash." "Cut the crap, your race of people seem to do a lot of talking. Are you going to fight or not?" Hephaestus had already moved as he said this, a twin pair of jagged bone daggers appearing in his hands as he flashed forward, appearing before Arden in a blink. Arden's brows furrowed as he dodged backward. He should have already realized after the first kick, but this enemy was, indeed, difficult to deal with. "It's up to you, brother," Arden shouted. Tsk, useless, Maya's first son, Oren, clicked his tongue before diving down as well. But before he could make it far, a blade force threatened to smite him, surging from the air and piercing through everything in its wake. Oren came to a stop immediately, pausing just before the piercing blade could take his head. Bang! Joel appeared holding a silver-black halberd. He wasn't nearly as talkative as Hephaestus, but his actions spoke loud enough. As Aina continued her massacre, both of Maya's sons found their paths forward impeded. It was clear to the both of them that there would be no extricating themselves in short order. Maya frowned. This situation seemed to be spiraling out of control. Her two sons were both born on Earth for the purpose of this mission. They had the talent of the cloud race while benefiting from Earth's talent as well. With the two of them, this matter should have been easily dealt with, but for some reason it was the exact opposite. The both of them were still in the sixth dimension, so she knew they hadn't truly come into their own yet, but this was more troublesome than she thought. She thought she had understood the strength of Earth quite well, so what was this? Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 1886. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 52 seconds p.m. Chapter 1886. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1886. That's enough. Previous chapter. Aina didn't seem to see any of what was happening around her. Every time she came across an enemy, she would swing with all her might, and yet her stamina seemed to be entirely endless. Even putting her everything into every strike, she had still yet to sweat a single bead. With every step she took, she closed the distance between herself and the Brazinger geniuses. It soon became quite obvious that she wanted their heads. She didn't care how deep into the battlefield they were. She didn't care how many she had to kill to get to them. She didn't even care if they ran toward her or ran away. No matter what, trapped in this cage, her blade would reach them eventually. Raffer and the others were stuck in an awkward situation. To their front, Nana protected them from Galeran. But Galeran was also in a partial stalemate with Maya, seemingly controlling her movements as well. Galeran had told them to leave, but even if they had a change of heart and took such an option now, it was impossible. There was simply no leaving with the restrictions placed down. The only two seventh-dimensional experts they had with them were both occupied, one being little Nana, and the other being her elder brother who was still battling King Arthur above. As things stood now, this was a very poor position to be in. While the battle in the capital seemed to be reaching a choke point where very few would survive, other regions were suffering from different circumstances. The sudden lockdown of Earth placed the defecting faction in a state of unrest. Originally, many of them had chosen not to act due to a confluence of reasons, but the ultimate deciding factor for many was that neither the Cloud race nor the four great families required them to battle. Sitting on the sidelines was an easy decision for many of them, especially when the alternative required battling alien races so much more talented than them. However, what they hadn't expected was for the Ascension Empire to have such a contingency. Now they were all trapped like rats. Within the White Angel province, previously ruled by the Siegfried family and now taken over by the Bennett family, James' father was oddly calm, in sharp contrast to his son who could only look up at the birdcage they were all stuck in with a pale face. James hadn't even been able to make a decision before this happened. James didn't fear battle, nor did he fear death, but for some reason, he couldn't control the blood draining from his face. He felt as though something was slipping away right before him and he couldn't grasp exactly what it was. But in typical fashion, his father didn't seem to realize at all. "They're here," Governor Duke Bennett suddenly spoke. At that moment, the courtyard they were in rumbled and several figures appeared. However, not a single one of them was human. There were only a small number, just a dozen or so, but every one of them was a member of the Cloud race. Governor Duke Bennett casually sipped his tea. You. When James saw this, he froze, unable to breathe. Now he understood where that uncomfortable feeling had come from. His father wasn't just betraying the Ascension Empire, he was betraying the human race. No matter how James felt, he could understand and even somewhat support his father's disregard of the Ascension Empire. Their family could have never lost the Governor-Duke position to begin with had it not been by tacit acceptance of the Fox family. Back then, they had closed one eye and allowed their family, a family that had been there to support the empire from the very beginning, to fall into depravity. If it hadn't been for the tenacity of his grandfather, and his father after him, the Bennett family would have been eradicated by their enemies, let alone managing to maintain hold over a Tier 5 official position like they had. However, this. Governor Duke Bennett waved a hand to signal his son to remain silent. What is the plan from here? He asked. From my understanding, there are very few of you stationed outside of the capital, as the original plan was to flatten them in one go. One of the Cloud race individuals sneered. We've already checked the formation, it has no other abilities other than to trap us within. But what good is it to trap yourself in the cage with a lion? Wouldn't the result be the same? In fact, this situation is even better for us, the capital will be dealt with in even shorter order. The plan hasn't changed at all, just patiently wait. I see. That's about what I thought, but the Fox family isn't as simple as you think. I hope you all aren't taking this lightly. I've already taken the liberty of making a few contingencies in case of your failure. Our failure? Haha. The Cloud race man chuckled. You are quite arrogant for a human. Governor Duke Bennett sipped at his tea. I am only doing what is necessary for my family to flourish. James stood to the side, practically vibrating. That's enough. The roar shook the estate. The Governor Duke looked toward his son and raised an eyebrow. James shivered when he saw that look, all of his momentum being doused in a bucket of cold water. He had seen that look too many times before, and he always shrunk before it. James clenched his fists and lowered his head, his next words becoming caught in his throat. The Cloud race man raised an eyebrow. Is this going to be a problem? Why would it be a problem? He's my son. James, go down to the brothel and take the next 3 days off. You don't have to worry about any of this. Leave it to me. James clenched his teeth. Didn't you take a liking to that Samoa girl? I'll let you take her as a maidservant, just go off and be obedient. At that moment, a light giggle came from a Cloud race woman that made James freeze. Chapter 1887. Published at 25th of May 2023 1:07 and 52 seconds p.m. Chapter 1887. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1887. Answer me. Previous chapter. James' head snapped toward the Cloud race woman, his gaze filled with a hint of confusion. He didn't immediately respond to his father, it was just that giggle sounded far too familiar. You, who are you? James asked. The Cloud race woman blinked, tilting her head. She didn't seem to want to answer. Or maybe wanting to answer was the wrong way to put it. It was more like she disdained to or didn't feel like speaking with James. Hey, I asked you a question. James said coldly, his pale face slowly becoming more rosy. At that moment, he wasn't the same James that faced his father. That sort of fear was only something his old man could induce in him. To everyone else, he was a general who commanded respect and fear himself. The Cloud race lady snorted. James, did I not already dismiss you? Governor Duke Bennett said coldly. James clenched his teeth but didn't turn back to his father, instead taking a step forward. This land is Bennett land, these skies are Bennett skies, when I asked you a question, you answer. James' voice boomed, a wild fluctuation of force causing the nonchalant expressions of the Cloud race individuals to change. In fact, even his own father fell into a momentary silence. The Cloud race woman recovered quickly, though, giggling again. Fine, fine. Is there a need for such a look? Did I not give you a good time? The face of the cloud race woman changed into a very familiar one for just a moment before reverting back. That face was none other than Samoa, the very prostitute his father had mentioned earlier. James felt his heart drop to his stomach. Did he care for Samoa? Hardly. He had never fallen for any woman, at best he just somewhat preferred her to the other brothel workers. She was beautiful, smart, and seemed to work there not out of necessity but rather because she enjoyed that line of work. He felt that he could relax around her. He didn't need to worry about her having a mental breakdown because the last month's abuse had finally gotten to her, and he didn't need to worry about her trying to manipulate him into loving her so that he could save her. That latter story had happened too many times before and he always had to change his favorites as a result. He could be said to be a veteran of brothels and he knew how to maneuver around them to maximize his fun and minimize the headache. But ironically, it was because of this that a prostitute had become his only real refuge. The nonsense about taking her as a maidservant wasn't even something that James had brought up to his father. The Samoa he knew wouldn't even want to accept such a proposition, even though it was a much higher line of work and much safer as well. He respected her choices so he never even thought of it. However, it was very typical of his father to keep tabs on his actions and comment on them from time to time, so he hadn't thought much about it until he heard that giggle. The laugh was slightly different, but the cadence was almost exactly the same. He had heard that laugh far too many times, more times than he could count. Samoa was the kind of woman that could laugh in any situation, whether that was while he was railing her from behind, or when some drunkard got too unruly and grabbed her collar. It was the same laugh no matter what the situation. You are Samoa? You've been pretending to be her? Where is she? The more James spoke, the more furious he became. James, that's enough. Before James could respond to his father's words, the cloud race woman giggled again. Pretending to be her? Do you think I would let a human put his penis inside of me? Do I look like a masochist to you? Every time you thought you were railing your favorite little prostitute, you were just taking a nice nap. It was the very same tactic Maya had used with Governor Duke Luem. When the latter had thought she was pregnant, she brought out embryos she had already conceived in the cloud domain and allowed them to grow on Earth, thus allowing them to gain Earth's talent boost. The cloud race was far too adept at playing with the minds of their targets. Just as easily as they could imitate a target, they could fabricate one from thin air as well. How could they not monitor a wild card like Thames? They've had known from the verve beginning that he was no tential than Roblem. Governor Duke Bennett sighed and rubbed his forehead. Working with these people truly was annoying. James, that's enough. I won't repeat myself again, you can go now. Suddenly, James turned back to his father. You knew. It didn't seem like a question. Rather, it was a statement. He seemed to already have his answer. Watch your tone, young man. You knew. James repeated. Governor Duke Bennett frowned, his brows pinching together. Bang! He slammed his teacup down, standing to his full height. Of course I knew. You lack discipline, going around sticking your dick in everything. Do you think the seed of the Bennett family can just be spread around as you please? If it wasn't for my actions, how many babies by how many different mothers would you have now? For the first time, rather than cowering in the face of his father's roars, James' gaze turned crimson. You've done this other times? Governor Duke Bennett seemed to have realized that his son had finally reached his limits, but he didn't back down either. James, I said that's enough. Leave. Bang. Suddenly, Samoa moved, appearing behind James and chopping at his neck. I'll just deal with this, what a waste of time, she said lazily. Slap. Crack. James suddenly turned, grabbing her wrist and forcefully twisting it. A scream echoed in the courtyard, but James had already kicked out. The sole of his foot drove into her abdomen with such force that the arm he was still holding onto ripped out of her socket, the rest of her body flying out. James! Governor Duke Bennett roared. Shut up. A wild aura soared into the skies, suffocating everyone in the province. James' gaze turned entirely crimson, plumes of force coming off of him like hot steam. With a thought, his father was encased in an energy shield he had no method of breaking out of. James' gaze landed on those of the cloud race. This will be your burial ground. Chapter 1888. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:49 and 24 seconds AM. Chapter 1888. Do you think? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. James seemed to unleash decades of frustration all at once. Everywhere he passed only destruction was left in his wake. From looking at him, one would never think that he was born with a defensive ability index. He manipulated his energy shields as though they were weapons and armors integrated into one, blocking all attacks that rained down on him, all while suffocating his enemies with an oppressive attack volley. A cloud race man appeared to his side, punching with a deathly momentum. However, James struck out with just a single palm, a dense energy coating the skin of his hand, dispelling the enemy's power and sending back with more than double the strength once his own power was added to it. The cloud race man's forearm splintered like wood, and yet James didn't seem to want to let him retreat. Taking another step forward, he clawed out with the same hand, swiping down at the air with a crimson gaze and a deathly momentum. Bang! 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 3 heavy energy shields fell from the air like steel plates. The cloud race man hurriedly retreated, avoiding the first and just barely escaping the fate of having his body cut in half along his shoulders, but even so, he was a step slow. This resulted in his extended arm being cut off at the elbow. The second heavy energy shield fell as the man continued to retreat, but he was a step slow once again, causing his arm to be severed at his shoulder. The third heavy energy shield was too fast. The cloud race man froze, his body shuddering just once before he fell down in 2 halves. How dare dash! James had already turned to a new enemy. With a grip of his fists, his 3 heavy energy shields fused into one, forming a wall thicker than a back vault that he sent flying forward with a violent momentum. Many of the cloud race managed to dodge, but 2 failed. It was as though they had just been rammed by a heavy truck, their bodies bursting into a cloud of blood, disregarding their defenses as though they weren't there at all. For some reason, scanning James was useless. They tried again and again, but they found their attempts blocked, and then blocked again. It was only at this point that they realized that James' energy shield ability index had gone beyond just blocking the physical. He could protect himself even from attacks that couldn't be seen clearly with the eyes. The current James stood as close to tier 5 of his ability index as one could get without being a savant. In all these years, without friends, and with nothing more than battling for his family on his mind, his skill had reached an impossible height. And now that he was enraged, they would have a true front row seat. Bang! James descended with a heavy stomp, crushing everything in his path. He crossed through the courtyard with speed, agility, and ferocity. Eventually, the cloud race realized they had no ability to deal with him and tried to run, but this was the absolute worst decision they could make. When it came to restriction and control, how many could be much better than one wielded an energy shield ability index? With a thought, the entire courtyard was enveloped in an impenetrable shield. The cloud race tried pounding at it to escape, but they had already scattered, trying to force James to chase them individually. However, that only made them easier to pick off. They tried to attack the barrier again, but this time they found that it became soft and spongy. Their fists and weapons were embedded within and it felt as though they had struck at clouds. They tried to pull their strikes back, but the barrier suddenly surged forward like jelly, wrapping around them. Samoa screamed and waved her hand wildly, but there was nothing she could do as the wild energy continued to snake around her, coating her as though she was falling into quicksand. The harder she struggled, the further she sunk into it. Soon, the remaining cloud race members found themselves coated from head to toe. Although they weren't injured, they were all smart enough to know that this was the absolute worst-case scenario. With things like this, they were truly finished. James looked at them coldly. His gaze shifted until it landed on Samoa. I hope you have a fun time giggling in the afterlife. James squeezed his fists just once and the cloud race individuals only had a chance to screech once before their bodies were crushed. They died hardly able to fight back at all. James finally turned back, still fuming. Killing them couldn't seem to get rid of his frustration, but when he looked back to find his father calmly sitting within the energy shield he had trapped him within, all of that rage seemed to dissipate. For some reason, he couldn't find it in himself to stay enraged. With a wave of his hand, James released his father. He never had the heart to kill his own father, he had only trapped him so that he wouldn't interfere. Governor Duke Bennett didn't say anything immediately after being released. He looked at his son for a long time before shaking his head. It doesn't matter, a man needs to vent his emotions sometimes, but it's good that you've regained your calm. This shouldn't be too big of a problem since you made sure that none of them escaped. We will just blame their deaths on the Ascension Empire and everything will be dash. James frowned. Dad, siding with the cloud race is too far. Governor Duke Bennett looked up calmly. Excuse me? James took a deep breath. I said siding with the cloud race is too far, they don't have our best interests at heart. If Earth is taken by them, the only 8th-dimensional world in the human domain will no longer be under our control. In that situation, won't we still be slaves? But this time, we'll be slaving for someone who treats us as nothing more than ants and have a great amount of prejudice against us. Governor Duke Bennett's expression turned cold and a stern and powerful voice came out from him. Do you think I need you to tell me how to do things? Chapter 1889. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:49 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1889. Go. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. James was startled for a moment before he lowered his head. Things weren't much different from what they always had been, he was too used to this. Wherever there are people, there will always be in groups and outgroups. Even when there are no tiers of separation, people will find them. If it's not race, it will be skin tone. If it's not skin tone, it will be culture. If it's not culture, it will be wealth. Even if there are two groups of people, both of the same race, with the same skin tone, the same culture, the same wealth, people might try to separate themselves based on who is a nouveau riche and who comes from old money, or on who was born in the north of the city versus the south, or on what gods they choose to follow, or what foods they like to eat most. When you sit here and try to lecture me on what the cloud race may or may not do, or on how they may or may not treat us, do you know how absolutely foolish you sound? Even the Ascension Empire was forced to use the Slayer Legion as a scapegoat to maintain peace for decades because there can never be true peace. Even when such a thing is achieved, it will only be a fleeting moment from vanishing. It only takes one man's greed, one wife's dissatisfaction, one child's grievance. This is the nature of life, of evolution. Do you know why you can stand here and listen to this lecture from me? It's because you hold power. They infuriated you, so you slaughtered them and they could say nothing about it. Do you know why they tolerated my questioning them? It was because I provide them with resources they need, power they need, connections they need. Who cares whether they share our race or not? Can you provide them value or not? Did the Ascension Empire care when your grandfather was schemed against by the Luem family and lost our Governor Duke position? Were we not fellow humans? Further than that, did we not share the same status? The same wealth? The same nobility? Even further than that, did we not bleed for the Fox family? Did we not lose brothers and sisters for the Fox family? Did we not help them to build their empire to what it is now? The more Governor Duke Bennett spoke, the louder he seemed to become and the further his son's head seemed to lower. Did we not meet all the criteria you think to be so important and even surpass them? And yet we were thrown to the side, for what? The reason is very simple. We weren't useful enough. Others were more valuable. Your grandfather trusted the wrong people and he suffered for it. In this world, you can trust no one but yourself. There are no goals that are worth more or are more valuable than your own. There is no friendship worth your aspirations. The only people you can trust is family, and that's not because of some bullshit reason like love. I have an investment in you because you are my seed. I invested in your growth, I've protected you, and now you are the greatest weapon this family has. Do you understand me? Governor Duke Bennett's voice boomed. James' head remained lowered and he didn't answer immediately. When he did speak, he asked a question that weighed on him heavily. Doesn't that mean if there was ever a reward worth more than your investment in me and better than what I can provide you in the future, you would sacrifice me as well? Look at me, Governor Duke Bennett said coldly. James slowly raised his head. When Governor Duke Bennett saw his son's crimson gaze, his own narrowed, but he still looked forward without flinching. Yes, I would. Governor Duke Bennett said just as coldly. And I hope that if you see an opportunity to progress the Bennett family forward, you would sacrifice me as well. However, this lashing out and losing your temper, isn't the way. You're never going to get anywhere like this. James looked at his father, the crimson in his gaze slowly fading. His lips separated slightly, but no sound came out for a long while, until he finally managed to push it out. Don't you feel lonely? Governor Duke Bennett's expression seemed to change for the first time. Inwardly, his heart raced and it took several moments before it returned to normal. Men with heavy weights on their shoulders have no right to feel such emotions. You are cut from almost the same cloth as me, James. You don't fall easily for women no matter how pretty they are, you aren't good at academics, but you are able to focus on what you are good at with great ease. When you feel emotionally drained, you vent for only a moment before you regain control and put your nose to the grindstone once again. Your only weakness was that Lionel, but that couldn't be helped. He's more perfect for this sort of life than you are. His ability to sever emotions is beyond mine, his ability to focus is beyond the both of us, and he has no holes in either his emotional or raw intelligence. Staying near him, you stood no chance. Your separation was necessary, it was the only way for you to grow into your own without being suppressed within his shadow. Governor Duke Bennett looked into the skies. There is no fairness in this world, this is why you must take my words to heart. It's even more apparent when it comes to things like talent. You must be willing to do things others aren't if you want to succeed. Governor Duke Bennett fell into complete silence. Go, Governor Duke Bennett suddenly said. James' brows shot up, seemingly feeling that there was something different about his father's words. I can see that you don't believe in me the same way anymore, there's no use in keeping you here. Things might be fine for now, but in a year or two, you'll finally cross a point of no return. Also, judging by how easily you killed those Cloud Race members, I have a feeling they've long since overestimated themselves. Your leaving is probably the only way to save the Bennett family at this point. Governor Duke Bennett continued to look into the skies, seemingly seeing Lionel's face within the complex runes of the dome of white gold above them. He remembered that night he first met Lionel. He was beaten and ragged, facing off against an entire fort and having just lost his girlfriend as a teenage boy, and yet still sharp enough to see through a ruse planned by his best friend of over a decade. In that sort of situation, Governor Duke Bennett was certain that even he wouldn't have the ability to stay so clear-headed, even given his long life and wealth of experience. That sort of sharpness wasn't something you could teach. He couldn't help but wonder if Lionel had expected this to happen too. Chapter 1890. Published at 8th of June 2023, 9:49 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 1890. Blackened wood. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel looked down at his beaten and ragged spear, taking a breath and exhaling. As he had expected, his speed of clearing these hurdles had increased exponentially with the help of Purina's treasure, but what he hadn't expected was to end up locked in such a battle not long after seemingly bright skies had opened up to him. Before Lionel, a twin-horned demon stood before him. Well, it only had one horn remaining, the other having been cut off by Lionel and sent spiraling into a tree in the distance. Well, several trees. Whatever that horn had been made out of, it was so sharp and sturdy that it wasn't satisfied until it had razed thousands of acres of land to the ground. As best Lionel could tell, this person was probably a fiend-class demon, or close to it. Compared to the other geniuses Lionel had fought, this one was probably the most difficult up until this point because his body was so exceptional. While the strength of Lionel's body came from his lineage factors and had been mostly stripped from him, the strength of a demon was innate to their flesh and blood. Facing this genius of the demon race, Lionel had no advantage despite having cleared hundreds more territories. Let alone not having an advantage, he was faintly losing and was somewhat inferior. What was the most infuriating was that outside of his horn, every other part of this fiend demon's regeneration was top class, another very innate part of its being. Lionel had never felt the unfairness of the tribulation more clearly than he did now. Even so, Lionel's skill with the spear was more than just one step above this demon that called himself Kaldar. As such, he had been able to corner the latter several times, but to no avail. The demon hadn't spoken a single word, but his tenacity was all too clear and obvious, and his stamina was seemingly no weaker than Lionel's. Lionel glided backward, taking one more deep breath before his body stabilized entirely. He met the eerie yellow gaze of the demon who stood an entire meter taller than himself without the slightest hint of fear. He looked down at his spear one more time before shaking his head and throwing it to the side and unsheathing the base spear that had already grown to the point of nearly crossing into the gold grade. Unfortunately, while the basic spear could repair from damage, treasure spears and armors could not. Now that the lance spear had run its course, Lionel had no choice but to let it go, and with it, he lost access to Knight's charge. Lionel's wrist flexed, his forearm waving once. The strength of this brandishing was so fierce that the spear tip swayed wildly from side to side, the rigid polearm moving as though it was instead a wet noodle. The spear blade moved almost hypnotically, swaying with a quick rhythm that made it quick and unpredictable. Even so, the fiend demon didn't move a single inch. He had no way of knowing that Lionel's Knight's charge ability came from the spear he had just thrown to the side. But what he did know was that even without Knight's charge, Lionel's agility was beyond his own. In that case, he would stand in place and let Lionel come to him. Lionel suddenly thrust forward, his spear whipping through the air and its blade vanishing into a cascade of blinding gold lights. "I'll grind you down until you have nothing left to give," Lionel spoke resolutely. The fiend demon once again didn't respond, but a hint of sullenness touched his yellow gaze as he brandished his own spear to block. Aina might as well have been the mirror image of Lionel on the battlefield. Although one faced one enemy while the other faced many, their ferocity could only be said to be identical. Many had thought that she would tire by now, but it eventually became quite obvious that she was far too confident in her own battle sense to make such a foolish mistake. Near the back of the battlefield, Harmony fought as well. She was more of a reserve unit, prepared to act as a trump card when the situation dictated it, but she was beginning to feel as though she was entirely unneeded. At the same time, her internal fear for this woman was growing with every second. It was easy to not notice just how brutal Aina was being. When lives were severed with just a single swing of her battle axe, it was easy to become numb to it. However, the screams, the panic, the palpable fear that was slowly condensing in the air was quickly increasing to the point that it was suffocating. As more and more powerful enemies faced off against Aina, the brutality only became more clear. Soon, they realized that maybe it would have been a blessing to be weaker. At least then, the torture would have ended immediately. She severed arms, stomped through chests, crushed windpipes. There was even a warrior who suffered the fate of having their rib cage pulled apart and their hearts ripped out from their chest. Aina had cut into this warrior's right shoulder with her battle axe. When she failed to go all the way through, she punched into the left of the warrior's chest, ripping his chest open by pulling her hand and axe apart. As though she wasn't satisfied with the result, before this warrior could even fall to the floor, she ripped his heart out, the spurt of blood coating her armor and droplets dotting across her cheeks and face. The more the Brazinger family saw, the more shaken they became. It couldn't have been more obvious that her target from the very beginning was them, and very soon, the only one separating them from severing their head was Galeran, and obviously Galeran had no intention of stopping her. Aina's golden gaze shone like two radiant stars as she slammed the butt of her polearm into the dirt. She passed by little Nana without a single word, seemingly not worried that the latter would attack her. She looked forward in silence, her aura climbing with every passing second. A long way to her back, dozens of rotating blood roses continued to shred a path through the battlefield almost without her input at all. No one knew why Aina had stopped until her spatial ring glowed. One after another, she took out stakes. Each one was carved of a blackened wood and stood at exactly 9 meters tall and were just about 2 feet thick. It wasn't obvious at first, but the Brazingers shuddered when they saw it. Every time Aina's palm touched this seemingly simple wood, another layer of her skin would be burnt off, droplets of blood falling and the smell of rotting flesh wafting into the air. Chapter 1891. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:49 and 1 second AM. Chapter 1891. Black wood. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Oh? You recognize these? Aina asked softly. I guess you would, right? She took her time to stake the wooden pillars into the ground. Every time she touched it and another layer of her skin fell to the ground, rotten and sizzling, the Brazingers would flinch again. They couldn't even feel Aina's earlier rage, and yet this silence felt so much more oppressive, the heaviness of it all gripping at their throats and pressing down. They call this black wood, a simple name, quite short, succinct. I guess its history speaks for itself. The calmness in Aina's voice was eerie. They had heard too much about this supposed black wood, enough to know that most wouldn't dare to even try to handle it without specialized equipment, and that went for experts that surpassed even the 7th dimension. Just looking at the ground they were pierced into told a story of 1,000 words. Black veins pulsed into the soil, drying and cracking the land as though a curse was slowly spreading through it. This didn't seem to stop until the phenomena had stretched over 10 meters from the location of the pillars of black wood. Look at you all, already in the 6th dimension and yet so afraid of this wood. It doesn't move, it doesn't bite, and yet you mighty Brazingers can't look at it without shivering. I wonder how you'd react if you were in the 3rd dimension like my mother. Raffer felt his heart leapt into his throat. Not long ago, he had been planning on making Lionel pay for simply being associated with Aina, a stain on their family. And yet, now standing before the woman herself, he couldn't seem to even look her in the eye. Who knows, Aina continued, maybe it wouldn't matter much. I heard that this wood had very unique properties. Regardless of who touches it, the suffering is the exact same. It never speeds up or slows down, always moving at its own pace. I honestly planned on using this on the woman and the executioners who acted that day, but I think I've changed my mind. My man showed me a better way. Your entire family is rotten to the core, it would be better if you all rotted for an eternity together, don't you think? Aina lowered her hand from the tree, the rotting flesh on the palm of her hand not moving her in the slightest. This was a sort of pain that she had dealt with every moment of every day, and let alone her hands, it had appeared on her face. Just to avoid having to deal with it, for much of her youth, she wore a thin mask over her face, masking much of it. It wasn't until she gained Lionel's cleansing waters did that horrible, unbearable pain lessen, but by then it had already been almost 2 decades. To her, this was absolutely nothing, and seeing the fear on the faces of the so-called Brazinger geniuses before her, she only felt more disdain and disgust. Her mother had been nothing more than a normal woman, a frail woman without any sort of special bloodlines or abilities, a common woman of the 3rd dimension. And yet they had tied her to this pillar entirely in the nude. Aina's father had never described how it had happened, but Aina had enough knowledge now to understand exactly what would have happened. Beaten and ragged, humiliated and stripped, her mother was strapped to one of these pillars back first after her head was shaved entirely bald, leaving nothing between her and the black wood outside of a special cushion between her skull and the pillar. The black wood's curse would slowly slip onto the fair skin of her back, eating away at it slowly. It would make it sizzle and crack, a sick burning sensation piercing into her very soul as it peeled away layer by layer. By the time it got to her muscles and fat beneath, the curse would have already started eating away at the front of her body like a slowly burning flame, just taking off one layer at a time until she was nothing but a husk of bleeding flesh. The black wood wouldn't sense this at all, only continuing to do its diligent work as it ate through her flesh, peeling away her muscles. Any normal 3rd dimensional existence would have already died by now. The shock would be too great and the mortal human body could die even to burns that were too severe, let alone having all of your skin systematically burned away by a cruel curse. However, this was the truly sickening ability of the black wood. The scent it created from rotting flesh could force lucidity and force one to stay alive. At the same time, because the black wood didn't work on bone nor nerves, but only on unrelated flesh, even when there was no longer any flesh on Aina's mother's back, she was forced to continue suffering, her nerves and spine remaining perfectly intact. With the cushion between her skull and the pillar, the last thing to disappear was the intricacies of one's expression and the sound of one's voice. Everything from the horrified screeches of pain to the twisting of one's expression when sounds could no longer be made were laid out for the entertainment of those watching. When it was all finished, there would be nothing left but a skeleton, a bundle of nerves and an intact brain. In that state, one couldn't see, nor touch, nor hear, nor smell. The only sense remaining was the eerie cold breeze passing over your exposed nerves, back and forth, again and again. You were forced to endure in that state, trapped in your own mind, until the fumes of your own rotting flesh had dispersed enough that you could finally die. With fail, no matter what the strength of a person was, this would take exactly 99 days, no more, no less. Then, as though to add insult to injury, your skeleton would be beheaded, your bones ground to ash and then stirred into the mortar that formed the execution platform. While Aina stood there calmly, recalling all of these matters without the slightest expression on her face, these thoughts continued to run through her head. She slowly picked up her battle axe, angling it forward toward the enemies before her. Come die. You four will be the first, and soon, they'll make the rest of you follow. Chapter 1892. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:48 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 1892. Momentum. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Raffer trembled, his body quaking. But when he saw his sister take a step forward, he felt his body relax before he felt a deep hint of shame. He talked big, but he actually didn't have as much courage as his sister, let alone as much talent. Sarathana shook her hand just once and a mighty crimson glaive appeared. When she took another step forward, her feet were decidedly heavier, and yet her movements were no less agile. By the time her foot raised for a third time, a momentum had begun to build up and she suddenly vanished, streaking across the battlefield. Bang! To Sarathana's shock, before her charge could reach its peak, Aina had already appeared before her, swinging down her battle axe. Seeing those expressionless golden irises, Sarathana felt her heart tremble. In just a single exchange, Sarathana was forced to take a step back, her wrists and forearms trembling. Her eyes widened. She had lost in raw strength to a halfling? Before she could think further about it, Aina's battle axe was already descending once again, the blade appearing by her neck as though it had teleported there. Sarathana hurriedly ducked and blocked with the polearm of her glaive. She gave herself just enough room to succeed in the second maneuver, but the strength of Aina's attack seemed to have increased. With her knees already bent, she was driven directly into the ground. The earth splintered and a crater was formed. Just the first impact formed a crater as wide as 3 meters from edge to edge and 3/4 of a meter deep on a 7th-dimensional world. But right then, with their blades still connected, Aina's eyes flashed and the veins along her forearms bulged. Bang! The crater expanded, the surge almost forcing Sarathana onto her back. Sister! Raffer and the others couldn't stand idly any longer. They didn't even bother to look toward the other 3 family geniuses for help, they would only get ridiculed. Their family had kicked out a halfling and couldn't even properly control her, this was nothing short of a stain and humiliation on them. They would be lucky if the others didn't kick them while they were down, let alone help them. Aina casually kicked out, nailing Sarathana right in the chest and sending her flying into the distance. She came out like a speeding bullet, colliding with Bar Ion before he could even get into a proper attack stance. The latter's forearm bones snapped on impact and he coughed up a mouthful of blood, falling into a pile a distance away along with Sarathana. Aina could have killed Sarathan right then and there. A genius? She didn't even feel like Sarathana, who was supposedly just a step away from the 7th dimension, was even worth more than a single exchange with her. All Aina wanted to do was bury them, to force them into submission, and then to force them to experience the same things her mother had experienced all those years ago. She would make sure every brazinger she got her hands on experienced the same thing. Raffer and the Dan appeared to her left and right with a fierce momentum. They knew that their lives were on the line, so they didn't hold anything back, crimson auras flourishing around the both of them. Aina's stance only shifted slightly, causing their blades to slip by the front and back of her. With one hand she tapped 2 fingers upon Raffer's wrist, with her other hand, she twirled her battle axe, causing the butt to bypass Theoden's defenses and uppercut him squarely on the chin. Theoden's jaw shattered into countless pieces on contact. Raffer's sword-wielding hand plowed into the ground under Aina's touch and he seemed to get off easy. Until Aina finished the twirl of her polearm, landing a hit on his shoulder blade from above that not only drove him further into the ground, but also shattered the bone into an even worse state than Theoden's jaw. In the distance, Sarathana unleashed a roar. Of them all, her injuries were the lightest only because of the armor that covered her chest. Her aura flourished and her crimson aura quickly formed the silhouette and a valiant warrior. It grew and grew until it stood at over 10 meters tall and solidified into a mighty mass. Every move Sarathana made, it too made, boosting her strength to a great degree as she dashed forward. Aina looked at this ability expressionlessly. She tilted her head to just one side, seemingly not noticing Sarathana's rapid approach. The ability was somewhat interesting to her, and she felt that it wasn't an ability index. Instead, it should be a technique that stemmed from the Berserk god lineage factor. It should work like. Aina observed it for what must have been only fractions of a second before her own crimson aura flourished, growing taller and taller until the point Sarathana felt so much despair she slowed her dead sprint, her feet dragging until they came to a stop with her looking straight up at a valiant Valkyrie. "I think I made it too big," Aina said lightly, words that made Sarathana's heart drop to the pits of her stomach. Even so, Aina's construct reached down, wrapping Sarathana's 10-meter-tall construct into a palm and squeezing. Sarathana shuddered, coughing up several mouthfuls of blood as her construct was shattered into pieces. She fell to her knees, her vision swimming. She realized then that she couldn't fight back, it was impossible. This woman was too strong. When she looked up she found that Aina was already standing over her expressionlessly. Even when Aina pulled her up by the hair, there was nothing Sarathana could do, her entire body having reached its limits in a pathetic few exchanges. Aina pierced her battle axe into the ground, lifting Sarathana up by the hair with one hand, and reaching for her armor with the other. Expressionlessly, Aina pulled, ignoring the injuries it caused Sarathana and ripping her armor off of her purposely. Sarathana grit her teeth in embarrassment, her chest being completely exposed to the world. "Stop. Stop. That's too much." The naive and delicate voice of Nana called out. Even while being pinned down by Galeran, she couldn't seem to hold it in any longer. Chapter 1893. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:48 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1893. Superiority and Greatness. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aina didn't seem to hear the words at all as she lifted Sarathana to eye level, almost as though she was picking up a chicken. She looked her right in the eyes as she gripped the waist of her pants, ripping them off as well. Sarathana closed her eyes, tears welling up within them. Even in the cruel environment of the Brazinger family, she had never experienced such humiliation. She felt herself be lowered, only to be dragged along the ground. Aina couldn't be bothered to waste the strength to keep her upright, pulling her along the graveled and bloodied grounds of the battlefield and toward the black wood pillars. Nana felt both flustered and aimless. On the one hand, Sarathana wasn't a member of her family and she also didn't know why Aina was so angry, though she had mentioned her mother. But on the other hand, she couldn't stand to see such a thing. But regardless of her feelings on the matter, she was worried about action Galeran might take without her here. Galeran also called Aina his niece-in-law, which must mean that Aina was Lionel's wife, and that only added another layer of complication. Nana really didn't want to have any conflict with Lionel. If Maya attacked, Nana might have a chance to take action, but the current state of things was actually positive in Maya's eyes. Right now, the greatest killing machine was occupied with a personal grudge, and although Aina's blood roses were still rotating on the battlefield, they were clearly less effective and weaker. Some had even been managed to be destroyed with some teamwork. Plus, she trusted her sons to defeat their enemies soon, and it didn't look like Noah and his helpers could hold out against Ellerin for much longer. The more Aina focused on this grudge of hers, the better chance they would stand. In the grand scheme, these few geniuses of the four great families were inconsequential. This was a battle of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. While someone of Aina's caliber or Nana's may be able to sway it, the others could not. Aina didn't seem to care about any of this at all as she lifted Sarathana up and began to tie her to the pillar. The moment her naked body touched the wood, a tragic scream left Sarathana's lips. It echoed over the battlefield and her strength was very clear and apparent from its resonance. But Aina didn't even flinch in the face of it. With calm movements, she tied her back to it and placed a cushion behind her head with a gentleness that made it look as though she was laying her to bed. Without a word, Aina continued with the other three. Raffer tried to struggle, but it was completely useless. One after another, they were all put up, their tragic screams continuing to echo. As the screams continued, the morale of the Cloud Race army began to slowly plummet, an entirely unforeseen outcome by Maya. She began to regret her inaction, but it was much too late for that now, far too late. Aina had already finished tying them up, the damage was done. However, just when it seemed that Aina was finished, she stretched a hand out and all of the blood within their four bodies surged out. They could hardly keep a clear mind under the excruciating pain, let alone stop their blood force from being snatched. Taking so much blood from them would normally kill them, but the aroma coming from their rotting flesh matched with the black wood pillars kept them alive. After being tied to these pillars, there was simply no escaping. Unless you had perfect control over your own soul and could force it to disperse, suicide was impossible. If they had been smart, they would have done everything to kill themselves before they were tied to the pillar, but they still held out hope. They hoped that if they endured, Aina and her allies would lose this battle and then they would be freed. However, they never expected Aina to take such a cruel measure. Now, no matter what, they would have to die. What they didn't realize, though, was that this wasn't the purpose of Aina snatching their blood. Slowly, and diligently, Aina began to draw 4 force arts into the ground using their blood. "I'm not very good with force arts," Aina said lightly. "I never invested much time into them and only have minimal experience." Aina's soothing voice sounded no different than the Reaper to them at this point, but with their heads still intact and her ability to penetrate through their screaming still at an all-time high, they had no choice but to listen to her words. However, when it comes to simple force arts with simple mechanisms, so long as I take my time, given the control I have over my body, they're actually quite easy to draw. Did you know that blood force is actually a very effective medium for force art drawing, just like soul and dream force? Aina continued to speak as though she wanted the last voice these people heard to be her own. "This one isn't too complex either. Its only job is to release a little bit of your blood on a day. Exactly 99 days from now, it will release the first batch, and then again, once per day, for example 900 more days." Aina looked up from her force art drawing. 99 days is a bit too short, don't you think? You're all so strong and superior due to your bloodlines. Since my mother was forced to endure 99 days as a common woman, it shouldn't be a problem for you superior existences to withstand 10 times that, right? Hearing Aina's words, the 4 began to fight harder and harder to get off the pillar as their skin was slowly eaten away at, but it was a completely useless endeavor. "Don't worry, I'll make sure the world knows how superior you all are to the rest of us. Every time your blood hits the pillar, more rotten fumes will form and your existence will be lengthened by another day. This way, you can definitely flex your boldness and greatness." Aina smiled lightly. It was objectively gorgeous, and yet it was the scariest thing those 4 youths had ever seen. Chapter 1894. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:48 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 1894. Hard life if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Aina clapped her hands once, a resonant sound echoing over the battlefield. At that moment, the rotting flesh on her hands seemed to have been smashed out of existence, fair and soft skin replacing them in the blink of an eye. Grabbed her battle axe, Aina rested it on her shoulders, looking toward the rest of the great family members. At the moment, the smile on her face was radiant, almost as though the cries of Sarathana, Raffi, Barian and the Dan were her favorite kind of music. With a step she crossed a large distance, catching the remaining youth off guard. But by the time they reacted, it was already too late. With the sky-piercing construct behind her, Aina's strength seemed to have increased tenfold. She hadn't even realized just how much strength she had been missing out on until this moment. In the distance, her blood roses grew explosively in strength, expanding by tenfold. Even the ones that were on the verge of destruction suddenly condensed once more, flourishing. If Aina had to describe it, it felt like she had accessed something similar to universal force, but it came directly from her body. In fact, she felt like she could make it so much stronger than it was currently. Every attack she made seemed to prove that all the more. Maya's expression changed. In the distance, Ellerin, who was pressing down on his three enemies, frowned, looking over. Noah's saber swung down, passing right through his body as though he wasn't there. Ellerin appeared a distance away, his gaze still locked onto Aina as a tortoise half the size of a city descended from above, smashing down from above with Jessica on its back. He was about to dodge again when Tyrion appeared to his side, a glistening sword ray flashing across his glasses as he pierced forward. Ellerin suddenly felt annoyed. These three were so weak, but they covered for each other well. He was trying to conserve his strength for what he felt would be an inevitable battle against Emperor Fox, so he hadn't expected to be stalled here for so long. His allies were truly too useless, not able to deal with one woman. It was ridiculous. Elrin's pupils constricted once more as Aina's strength seemed to continue skyrocketing. He had been certain that no one could match his speed of improvement, but Aina was improving by leaps and bounds. The youth couldn't seem to withstand even a single strike before, let alone now. Stop. Stop. Nana's agitation was growing. She couldn't just watch her own family members die like that. Even though she didn't know them personally, they still shared blood. Young miss, I would suggest you calm down. She doesn't have the same reservations you do. If you stand in her way, she will kill you, Galerin said lightly. Stop blocking me. Nana shrieked. She was in the 7th dimension, there was no way Aina could even think of killing her. She might be naive, but she wasn't stupid. It was clear that Galerin just had no intention of letting her go. Galerin remained silent. He could tell that this young girl had never experienced any setbacks in her life. To scream at an enemy like this as though it would work, this was beyond naivete. It was also laced with a heavy amount of entitlement. It was good that this young girl also seemed to have a kind heart, because if not, the result of that entitlement would probably be bad news for everyone around her. Tears welled up in Nana's eyes when it became clear that Galerin had no intention of letting her go. Red-faced and agitated, Nana's force seemed to almost spiral out of control, a radiant sapphire construct beginning to form to her back. It grew taller and taller, reaching a point where it matched even Aina's in size. Bind! She screamed, slamming out a palm toward Galerin. Galeron's eyes narrowed. He was about to move when his senses flashed. He had been paying attention to Maya all this time. How could he miss her movement? The issue was that she had timed it perfectly with Nana's outburst. Galerin sighed inwardly. It seemed that he was actually going to have to work a bit this time. Holding out his palms, Galerin suddenly began moving to an odd rhythm. It looked as though he was completing a routine of Tai Chi, his face the picture of peace. Bang! Bang! Maya and Nana's palms descended at the same time, colliding with Galeron's own. Both women felt as though they had rammed into a steel wall. Even though Galeron's sleeves fluttered wildly, he didn't move even a single inch. In fact, his elbows didn't even bend. Ouch, Galerin sighed. Maya's brows twitched unhappily. She felt like Galerin was making fun of her. She had thought that this was an excellent opportunity. Only for her to end entirely stifled. Suddenly, Galeron moved. Maya tried to pull back, but as though her palm was stuck to Galeron's, she found her body moving along with the arc of his palms. On the other side, Nana couldn't escape the same fate, her petite body being led like a horse to water. Galeron spun once, causing both women to be spun out. They soared into the air out of their control. With elegant movements, Galeron fluidly flowed into pressing his palms together once more. With a light exhale, he raised his right palm just slightly before pressing it toward the ground so slowly that it was almost agonizing. However, in response, the air seemed to compress above the flying women. As though the world itself was resonating with Galeron's movements, a concentrated and transparent pillar of air pressed down. Maya and Nana both coughed up a thick mouthful of blood as they were smashed to the ground below. Galeron sighed, smoothing out the slight wrinkles on his clothing. This was why he didn't like to battle, his clothing would be entirely ruined. Although he could shed some layers, that would be entirely unsightly. He was a gentleman, not a rogue. How could he fight without a shirt on? He had considered just wearing fashionable armor in the past, but he found the bulkiness and the flash of metal to be gaudy. He truly lived a hard life. Chapter 1895. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:48 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1895. Crimson red. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Maya coughed up a mouthful of blood, her eyes opened wide with astonishment. She had no idea what ability Galeron was using. She couldn't tell whether it was a unique ability, a technique, or maybe a known ability index being used in an unconventional way. At first she thought it was telekinesis. It made sense, that was why he could move so slowly and yet output so much power. It should also be the reason why her and that little girl's palms got stuck to one another. He should have been using telekinesis to make up for his lack of movement speed and momentum. However, just now, she felt an odd fluctuation of energy in the air, almost as though he was truly gathering up force to act on his behalf, but this was very different from the feeling that telekinesis should give. In addition, there was something unique about the movement of his body. Though he was moving slowly, he was gathering up momentum in his own way, as though it was a technique of some sort, or more accurately, a style. But if he was using the style to gather momentum, then that contradicted the fact he was using telekinesis. In addition, she had never seen someone so adept in using telekinesis to the point they could apply such force without emitting any fluctuations. If telekinesis left no traces at all, how would you even fight such a person? Wouldn't they be invincible so long as they had the strength to harm you and could cast perfectly invisible attacks? The worst problem though was that a technique should have left some sort of fluctuation as well, but the attack had come suddenly and without warning. The cloud race was well known for their senses and only fell short of the spirituals in this regard. If Maya couldn't sense it, then didn't that mean that he was entirely impossible to deal with? Across the battlefield, Aina's axe fell for the final time and she took a deep breath, the light smile still on her face even though blood fell like rain around her. If even the likes of Sarathana couldn't last a single exchange with her, the rest stood even less of a chance. The chorus of hoarse cries continued behind her like a symphony to her mother. Aina turned back to the rest of the battlefield, the tides very clearly turning in favor of Earth. Whether it was morale or strength, they had a step up in both regards. It felt like the cloud race was entirely unprepared for the level of power they would face, and that much was all too expected. The moment Maya was exposed, her planned surprise attack had failed. She had thought that it wouldn't matter much, but what she hadn't taken into consideration was the fact that in an upfront battle, the cloud race was actually inferior. The only true geniuses of the cloud race present here were her sons and herself. But her sons, who she had so much faith in, were still stuck in stalemates, while she herself hadn't lasted even a single exchange. Was this really the supposedly weak human domain? None of this made any sense. The presence of a world with eighth-dimensional potential was irrelevant. Maya herself came from a true eighth-dimensional world, not just one with the potential to become one. There was no way she should have lost like this. Suddenly, Maya had flashbacks to something that happened almost 3 decades ago. The plan has failed. Emperor Fox is far too ruthless. He preferred to slaughter billions of citizens to avoid an invalid infestation than risk it. Retreat, Maya. So what? A disdainful female voice came from the other side. The male voice sighed. Maya, think. Without an invalid infestation, the Ascension Empire will solidify incredibly quickly, making it far more difficult to infiltrate. Secondly, without the potential use of invalids and variant invalids as a spearhead, you'll be too short-handed. How are you going to take them down while suppressed under their world's laws and alone? I have my methods. Aren't you taking these humans too seriously? Watch well, Joram. Maya. You are my wife and you're carrying 2 of my children. Don't risk their lives and yours because of your pride. Retreat to the chaotic water sector with me. Together we'll sweep through Earth with much greater assurance. Our children will be fine, watch well. She still remembered hanging up that call. Now, her Joram's fate was unknown and she and their sons were in danger of dying here. Maya grit her teeth, standing slowly to her feet. Because of their control over their cloud figure, cloud race experts were able to shut themselves away much like Joram had, but this was only the tip of the iceberg. It could be used to do things like slow and manipulate their aging and had been a key part to Maya's plans until now. Even now, she was still considered a member of the cloud race's younger generation. While it seemed that she had experienced decades on Earth, in reality it was no more than a handful of years to her. It was also thanks to this ability that her sons had managed to remain embryos until she was prepared to use them. However, this age lock came with a double-edged sword, and that was the ability to store the skip time. If that time was never touched, everything would be fine and the cloud race individual would age as they had intended. However, in the case that this time was unleashed, the cloud race member would enter a state of accelerated evolution where they would experience all the years they had skipped at once. This was the greatest ability of the cloud race, an ability that could only be used by them with gold rune cloud figures, those with the greatest bloodlines of their race. There was, of course, a drawback. The consequences would always be tenfold. In order to experience all of the decades she had been on Earth for at once and gain the insights and strength that came with it, she would need to experience the equivalent of centuries. Even so, now that things had reached this point, Maya used the one trump card she never thought she'd have to. Maya raised her head to the skies, a screech that echoed over Earth billowing from her chest. The golden runes that floated within her cloud figure began to vibrate wildly, quickly becoming a crimson red. Chapter 1896. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:48 and 44 seconds AM. Chapter 1896. Anomaly. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took deep, heaving breaths. It had been a while since he needed to breathe so heavily to get something done. His battle with Kaldar lasted almost an entire week. Lionel wasn't sure if time in the tribulation and the time outside were the same or not, but regardless, a week here still very much felt like an entire week. Even when he clearly had the upper hand, the fiend demon had refused to give up, forcing them to continue the battle again and again. To make things worse, the fiend demon's regenerative abilities were simply off the charts. It didn't seem like Lionel could cause it a single injury that could actually harm it. Lionel continued to breathe hard, standing over Koldar's body. Finally, the demon couldn't seem to move anymore and simply looked up at Lionel expressionlessly. If it wasn't for the fact he too was also breathing hard, Lionel would have had a hard time believing that this demon was actually a living being. Well, that and the fact that he was basically immobilized, not his healing factor finally losing the ability to keep up. Even now, Kaldar hadn't given up. Lionel could see his muscles twitching as though he was still trying to stand. Lionel couldn't imagine what the battle would have been like if Kaldar had absorbed as many beast crystals as he had. Ironically, by now the advantage he had in terms of beast crystals was probably gone now than to this battle, and he probably didn't get much else outside of whatever treasures were on him and a couple hundred territories. In the grand scheme, it wasn't worth it, but he also didn't have the ability to choose to retreat. Theoretically, he could have used the orb Pririna had left behind, but because of one part pride, and another part because he felt that the reward would be worth it, he held on. Plus, he knew he had to defeat Kaldar no matter what. If Lionel had to guess, he was definitely the strongest genius here, the rest should be a cakewalk. "What is your name?" Lionel asked. Koldar's gaze flickered. There were a lot of race enemies, but maybe the one with the most division were humans and demons. Their cultures were strikingly different. It felt weird that a human was asking him such a question, especially since this was the first attempt at true communication. Kaldar didn't seem like he was going to answer for a long while, staring at Lionel with the same placid expression. When his mouth finally opened, though, the answer that came out wasn't an answer at all. "Why are you asking me that?" Koldar's voice was cold and gruff. Oddly enough, it reminded Lionel of a soothing clap of thunder, a completely contradictory description. It was as though he had managed to incorporate the rumble into his vocal cords. "Can't I ask out of curiosity?" Lionel asked with a laugh. "I don't like the way your eyes look. It makes me feel like you're trying to court me." "Ah." Lionel choked on his laugh. Did this big 3-meter-tall demon think that he wanted to take him out on a date? How had the conversation taken such a turn? "I like women, you do not need to know my name. Just kill me and finish your task." Lionel's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. He assumed that what Kaldar was feeling was his emperor's charm, though that should definitely be suppressed in this place. In the end, Lionel shook his head, completely rendered speechless. He bent down and snatched Koldar's spear away and turned to leave as the latter began to fade. Kaldar sighed. "I still do not like men. This will not help you in your pursuit of me." Lionel nearly tripped and fell, but by the time he turned back to say something, Kaldar had vanished. "What?" Lionel still had no idea what to say. He could only turn back and trudge away, taking deep breaths to try and quickly recover to his peak. He had to hurry and get out of this place. "Hold on." Lionel shook his head. He was so flustered that he almost made a stupid mistake. He turned and rushed back, looking at the location Koldar's corpse had vanished, but he was instantly disappointed. There was nothing there. It seemed that Kaldar hadn't gotten as lucky as himself or Pririna. Shaking his head again, Lionel shot off into the distance as he fused the two spears together. TCH. Still short. Lionel felt that he was still missing around 50 or so territories to reach the gold grade. Kaldar had definitely had a ton, but it wasn't quite enough. In another territory, an unknown distance away, two geniuses faced off against one another. Idrim chuckled. "Well, this is unexpected. I thought it would take us some more time before we had our final battle, but for some reason I can't find any other worthy opponents. I have a feeling that there's an anomaly this time around." Idrim's carefreeness was just as grating to annul as it always was, but this time rather than responding with annoyance, his expression remained solemn. He too had felt that there was something odd about this tribulation, the lack of treasure territories, the fact it was so hard to find worthy opponents. He hadn't come across any one of the other 6 outside of Idrim in all this time as well, and the only reason he had run into Idrim at all was because their territories had started off quite close. "I guess we'll have to find out which one of us gets to meet this mysterious variable between us, no?" Idrim raised his spear with a smile on his face. "It's unfortunate, though, one of us won't be able to reach the gold grade evaluation." Enul's expression became callous, his sized pairs of hands raising up, each with their own spear. With a thought, he vanished, appearing before Idrim with a deathly momentum. Chapter 1898. Published at 8th of June 2023, 9:48 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 1898. Ultimate Security Blanket. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. James clenched his jaw, taking a strong gulp as though he was forcing his heart back down. "He's still the same, directing everyone around like he already knows what they'll do," James mumbled. Aina smiled in understanding. Let alone James and the others, there were too many things that Lionel didn't explain even to her. If James took offense to this, there wasn't really much she could do, she would just have to reveal their other trump cards ahead of time. The trouble with that, though, was that it would make the air wars far more difficult. However, at that moment, James smiled. Do you know what they call a quarterback's tight end in football? James looked Aina in the eyes, his tears somewhat glistening but quickly evaporating away beneath a fiery blaze. Aina blinked before her smile brightened. The ultimate safety blanket. She had been following Lionel's games for years and had never missed a single one. Not only did she know all the rules of the game, when it came to the intricacies and the culture around it, she probably dwarfed even some of the players themselves. When James heard this, his head raised to the skies and he erupted with a laughter that drowned out even the cries of the Brazingers. It boomed with a vibrant carefreeness, surging like a rising ocean tide and drowning out everything. With a leap, he soared into the skies, his foot landing on an energy shield platform that he shot like a cannon off of, soaring over the battle between Maya and Galeran with the confidence of a man who felt he could have participated in it if he so chose. Aina watched this with a smile. It was a little white lie, and considering how well James knew Lionel, he probably knew this as well. But as Lionel's queen, there were some things that she felt she had to do for him. Lionel had many brothers, but he had only ever had one best friend, and there was a reason for that. Some relationships couldn't be forced, and some were too perfect to need to be. Lionel had set the probability of James making an appearance at 30%. He felt that the cloud race would be a bar that he wouldn't allow himself to cross, and he was correct about that. But Aina felt like he wanted that percentage to be much higher, not for any other reason than that was what he wanted for the man who he had once called friend. Aina could feel that Lionel was becoming more distant from the world, more detached, more indifferent. Even when his brothers had returned to his side, they had been separated for so many years that it was difficult to reaffirm that connection to the same level, and that was honestly because they were missing the glue that had kept them together in the first place. James seemed like an unruly, wild card with barely half a brain in him, but he was probably the person who understood Lionel the most outside of Aina herself, and maybe even in comparison to Aina, he knew more. At the same time, James and Lionel were more similar than it seemed. Just considering their fathers, with how much Lionel loved his own, if Velasco had the same approach to life that Governor Duke Bennett had, how far would Lionel be from just being a second James? The two of them were the most similar in the things that meant the most, the more dissimilar in, ironically, what was also the most important. Since these two brutes wouldn't take the steps to fix their relationship on their own, it would just have to be up to her. Aina smiled to herself, watching James dive into the battle and almost immediately force Ellerin into a retreat. Lionel had no idea what Aina had done, but at the moment he was too frustrated to care. He felt like he had traveled everywhere possible, but he couldn't seem to gather up enough territories. No random treasure or beast territories were spawning, and even after a lot of walking, there didn't seem to be any other participants waiting. He had come across one barrier, but it blocked him from entry. He had come across such a thing before, so he just assumed correctly that there was likely a battle going on within. Now, he had finally found another, and it was once again blocked. There seemed to only be one conclusion: there were just 3 contestants left. While he had been fighting Kaldar, everyone else but them had been wiped out. Lionel shook his head. How unlucky. If things were like this, that meant that he would have to go into this final confrontation while stuck at the silver grade, and given the fact there were only 2 contestants left, whoever came out victorious would almost certainly have a gold grade spear. Taking a breath and exhaling, Lionel retreated to his territory, then used the orb to lock his barriers down. If he was going to enter this final battle at a disadvantage, he would definitely do it at 100%. What Lionel didn't realize was how truly unlucky he was. Of the 6 strongest competitors, he had actually fought 4 of them and would now be fighting the 5th. However, due to his actions, everyone else was unlucky as well. Because he had sped up the timeline of the tribulation so greatly, less territories had spawned, and as a result, whereas in the past there would be multiple with gold grade evaluations, this time around, there would only be 1 if Lionel lost this battle, and only 2 if he did manage to gain victory. Lionel collapsed into a pile of soft grass and closed his eyes, taking the first sleep he had in as long as he could remember. He wasn't even sure exactly how long he had been in this tribulation. This sleep would turn out to be invaluable. They say the sleep consolidated everything one had learned during the day, and now. Lionel was consolidating weeks of training while entering a single deep sleep. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 1899. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:48 and 40 seconds AM. Chapter 1899. Elrond's Ability Index. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Elrond reacted quickly to James' appearance. Slide out of the way. James seemed to form his body into a cannonball, wrapping himself in a spherical energy shield as he fell from the skies. The air rushed around him with such speed that it sparked, a rush of fire and explosive force forming as he descended with a faster and faster speed. Boom! Elrond crossed an arm and his machete across his face, gliding back effortlessly as a wall of concentrated air collided against him. Although he was unhurt, he couldn't help but frown. The addition of yet another variable was annoying. The more this happened, the less he would be able to hold back. What was the cloud race doing exactly? Elrond glanced toward the battlefield and a spark of annoyance sparked in his pupils. This was the supposed cloud race? Weren't they supposed to be powerful and unmatched? Why were there so many who seemed capable of fighting them just fine? With another step, Elrond glided back further, avoiding pursuit with an ease akin to breathing. His gaze darted across the battlefield until he seemed to understand something. Under normal circumstances, the humans of Earth would stand no chance whatsoever. However, in concentrated pockets, scattered across the battlefield, there were small groups led by unconventional figures that seemed to subtly turn the tide. There was a young man with telekinetic abilities, a young woman wreathed in vines and flower. There were 8 young men whose power output was clearly a step above, and they didn't seem to be going all out either. There was another subtle white-haired beauty to the side, and finally, the most obvious of them all, there was the vicious golden-eyed woman who controlled blood force. This didn't even mention the 2 battling Maya's sons to a standstill, stopping them from becoming the anchors they should have been for the cloud race, or the obvious elephant in the room, Galarin. These people acted like anchors on the battlefield, and there was a subtle funneling action that took place, making it difficult for the cloud race to gather up momentum or target weaker warriors. In fact, it felt as though they were all being directed by something or someone to move all too seamlessly. If Wise Star Order could hear Elrond's thoughts, he would have nodded to himself with that very familiar smug smile on his face. Without Lionel here, who better to direct the flow of the battlefield if not Wise Star Order? It was just that as a monster of the 7th dimension, these children couldn't compare to him at all. His influence could hardly be sensed at all. In fact, the only reason Elrond could sense anything was because of the specialty of his ability index. Elrond fell into silence. He had concluded already, he had made the wrong bet. Suddenly, James appeared before Elrond. Elrond planned to dodge again, but his eyes narrowed when he realized that his paths of exit were all blocked by energy shields, very sturdy ones at that. James appeared with fist and Elrond had no choice but to respond with his own blade. Bang! James didn't retreat. With his ability index, his entire body was a weapon and he didn't fear meeting blades head-on. At least, that was what he was used to. He didn't even usually feel pain in battle because no one could force him to that extent. However, when Elrond's blade descended, danger senses alerted James instantly. James' fist opened up and the angle of the energy shield protecting him shifted. Elrond's blade slipped by, meeting slight resistance as it was parried to the side, but even so, a small layer of skin was peeling down James' knuckle. Elrond expected James to back off after suffering a small loss, but to his surprise James pressed forward with an even fiercer punch. Without a choice, Elrond could only meet it with a fist of his own. His hand left afterimages in the air, stacking 3, then 4 times. Bang! Elrond took a heavy step back as James did the same. Your ability index is actually time manipulation, James said with surprise. Noah, Jessica, and Tyrion were all shocked when they heard this. In between their heavy breaths, they overheard James mumble and found it difficult to believe. Was there really such an ability index? Elloren's gaze narrowed. Unfortunately, you have a very clear weakness, and that's the need for preparation. That's why your battle style is so evasive. The danger of your ability index plummets when you don't have time to play your little chess moves. The strength of Elloren's ability index started with his eyes. He was able to see timelines and the reverberating impact of causality. He could then gather these causalities and then use them to his benefit. For example, if he saw a future where he had crossed a distance of 1 kilometer, he could choose it and cross it instantly, skipping over the time it would have taken. However, everything had a balance. If he wanted to choose a future where he had crossed 1 kilometer, he had to first observe himself crossing that kilometer in said future, and that would take time. Of course, Elloren could accelerate this time, or else his ability index would be useless. However, no matter how fast he accelerated that observation time, it would never be instant. As such, there would always be a lag between him observing the future and enacting it. That was the weakness. Somehow, James had seen through this in a single exchange despite having never fought someone with such an ability index before. Time affinity was probably the rarest of all affinities in existence. To have a time-related ability index was even rarer than that. Elloren could be said to be one of one, a rarer existence than even savants. And yet it still took James just one exchange. It was shocking enough that Elloren spoke his first words. You have innate battle instinct. Chapter 1900. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:48 and 27 seconds AM. Chapter 1900, 2. 5x. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 5x. James picked at his ears. I don't know what that means, but if you're going to fight, I hope you have something better than this. If taking you down is too easy, how am I going to have the face to see the guys again? I need you to make me nice and bloody, preferably half dead. Aina was a long distance away from James' battlefield, supporting the others, but she was still paying keen attention in case anything went wrong. She wasn't entirely certain of how powerful James was, although Lionel had said it would be fine. But hearing him speak like this, her lip couldn't help but twitch. He and Lionel were really too similar, too good at pissing people off, and had mouths that were too smart for their own good. Elloren didn't say anything to James' words. Innate battle instinct wasn't something that was tangible or even a widely accepted concept, it was something he had only heard his grandfather talk about. Old Hutch used to say that there were simply some people in existence who had talent in battle that didn't conform with common sense. In truth, James' talent was bound to come out in one way or another. It was clear to everyone by now that the gene assessment wasn't a casual measure taken by the Ascension Empire. They knew that it could point them in the direction of talents that they could then preserve and save from the massacre. 5-star professions were especially rare, even in entertainment professions. On the entire Royal Blue Academy football team, only Lionel and James were 5-star. However, what was confusing was that while Lionel received an S-class evaluation after leaving the Mayan tomb, James only received an class evaluation. Of course, that was still far better than most of Lionel's other teammates that only received C and B class evaluations, but it was a hint disappointing for a 5-star. By now, those evaluations were quite useless as many had evolved far beyond those original markers, but they were still a baseline foundation for denoting potential. What no one could have expected was that the concentration of James' talent wouldn't come from ability index alone, but rather a more amorphous, auxiliary talent that was difficult to pinpoint, a talent buried in his very soul and one that had been fully unearthed only after he created his own lineage factor, becoming a true spark just like Emna. Elloren took a breath and exhaled. It was a subtle action, but his demeanor shifted entirely. It seemed that holding back was not an option. In truth, Elloren had no idea how powerful Emperor Fox was, he was only operating under a possible worst-case scenario. But since things had reached this point, there was simply no avoiding it. He would make one final push. Since the cloud race was useless, he would do it himself, and if he failed, there was no one better at escaping than he was. For Ellerin, with his current speed, crossing a kilometer didn't even take him a single second. In his base state, he could accelerate time by 2 times. Meaning, so long as he bought some time by evading in battle, he could witness the future at twice the speed anyone else experienced the present. After observing the future, he could pick a causality, but things weren't so simple. At best, he could observe 3 causalities at the same time. So, if he wanted to layer a punch more than 4 times 1 for his present, and 3 from addition causalities, he would need to reset and then observe again. And, of course, the causalities of others were very blurry to him unless he concentrated, which tied him down to observing only himself and things that acted directly on him. That said, this was just his baseline. This was a level of use that caused no damage to himself and took no energy whatsoever. He did this as easily as breathing, and he could do it practically forever at no cost to him. And unfortunately for his enemies, this was nowhere near his limit. "Let's see how you deal with 4 causalities then," Ellerin said lightly. Suddenly, Ellerin moved and James moved at the same time, both reacting at once as they clashed. The 4-layering of Ellerin's strikes became 5 seamlessly. It was hardly more difficult, almost as though he had gone from sitting on a bench to a brisk walk. James' eyes narrowed. This had already become a battle that Noah and the others couldn't participate in even if they wanted. Bang! 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 The 2 crossed blades and fists, dancing across the ruins of the palace as they glided around pillars and hard marble stone. "How about 6? Ellerin asked softly. The pressure increased once again. 7 Ellerins danced around James, each one just as real as the last. James grinned an ugly grin. He had asked for this and Ellerin didn't seem to hesitate to deliver. His own aura flourished, pieces of solidified energy shields slamming into place as they formed a radiant white gold armor dancing with complex runes. He blasted out a punch, but what was shocking was that the very force of the punch solidified a distance away, crumbling 2 of Ellerin's causalities. How about 10? James felt several punches collide with him, rattling his inner organs. Ellerin danced, his machete leaving elegant, curved streaks in the air. He seemed like a completely different person, his fierce attacks carrying shades of his grandfather as he pressed forward with greater and greater ferocity. James countered, but he quickly found himself on the back foot. He didn't feel like he was fighting one person, it felt like he was fighting 11, all of them just as powerful. Ellerin's power seemed to have almost tripled in an instant. Ellerin, a man who didn't speak much to begin with, seemed to have been truly triggered by James' words. He saw this as a battle for his parents, but not only were his allies nothing more than walking clowns, this nobody wanted to crack jokes. In that case, he would crack jokes too. How about 5x acceleration? The voice came in layers, echoing through the curtains of time of space. It seemed to touch on the past, present and future, linking them into one. Ellerin's blade left afterimages in the air, crossing into a causality that James could react to. PCHU. The machete seemed to pass through the plate armor on James' shoulder, ripping into his collarbone. Chapter 1901. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:48 and 25 seconds AM. Chapter 1901. Absorption. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Ellerin's machete pierced forward, his gaze expressionless as he suddenly unleashed his blade force. Without fail, such an attack would shred a person's inner organs to mush. Despite the fact he had just killed someone, he didn't feel very much at all. The exchange was quick, but he had expended quite a bit of energy. All he wanted to do now was to rush forward and end this battle as quickly as possible. Since the cloud race was such a disappointment, he would have to do everything himself. Ellerin pulled his machete back, but just as he was doing so, he froze. His blade didn't budge at all, even when he pulled harder. Ellerin's eyes narrowed. James' head was lowered, but he suddenly shook it. "Shit, that hurt," James mumbled. Elleron's heart couldn't help but stir. He hadn't felt his blade force being blocked, so where had it gone? It wasn't that easy to trick him. He wouldn't have made a foolish mistake like assuming his opponent was dead without reason. Suddenly, Elleron released a low hum and his body seemed to vibrate, becoming blurry. Several causalities stacked atop of one another and he pulled, finally, releasing his blade from James' shoulder as he slid backward, extending some distance between them. To his surprise, though, James' shoulder didn't gush with blood even though the wound showed no signs of closing. If one had to describe it, it was as though he had poured epoxy into the hole in his shoulder, leaving a glistening and clear gap that stopped his blood from flowing. James shook his head and exhaled. He had to admit that he had bitten off quite a lot this time, but he didn't feel very much fear at all. In fact, he grinned. His head rose and a malevolent color exuded from his irises, his broad shoulders trembling. No one really thought about what those with the energy shield ability index used to form their shields. It seemed to just happen, and most often it was nothing special, just a condensing of neutral force. However, James had realized that his ability wasn't so simple. If the energy shield ability index was broken down, its fundamental strength was in solidifying force so that it could be used as a defensive measure. A step deeper than that, and it was a force manipulation type of ability index, with a thought he could force to act as he wanted it to. A step deeper than that and he could change the fundamental structure of force itself to make it sturdier. A step deeper than that and he could change the structure of force to make it do whatever he wanted it to do. Neutral force, as Lionel had long since learned, was the perfect balance of all forces in existence. No, more accurately, the usual neutral force everyone was used to wasn't quite a perfect balance, it was rather pure neutral force that could be considered this absolute perfect balance. And it was precisely this force that James had learned to control. No matter what force it was, he could assimilate it. He had taken the tier 4 of his ability index to the absolute extreme, allowing him to. James pointed forward with a finger and a great surge of blade force manifested and shot out in a concentrated beam, more concentrated than even Elleron himself could make it, more concentrated than maybe anyone on Earth could make it. Bang! It shattered the sound barrier no more than a centimeter from the tip of his finger, accelerating so fast that it appeared before Elleron before he could blink even once. Elleron's heart skipped a beat. He pushed his time acceleration to 3x, just barely managing to dodge to the side. However, as he did, a fist appeared before his face. Elleron realized for the first time that there was no lane to dodge and he didn't have the time to raise his machete. Bang! Elleron's face twisted and one of his teeth cracked. His neck spun to the side and his body was sent flying backward, the harsh winds he experienced almost twisting his pristine white tracksuit to pieces. James landed nearby, looking down at his fist. Even in that situation, he had felt that his knuckles were on the verge of cracking. It seemed that Elleron could use his ability index even for defense despite the situation. It was versatile, indeed. Elleron spun through the air, landing harshly on his feet and leaving 2 deep trenches in his wake as he was forced to retreat again and again. James shook his head, then looked down at the wound in his shoulder. Do you think that this is enough? Or do I need to let you stab me a few more times? Elleron pupils constricted. Forget it, if I let any more of this happen, they'll think I went Hollywood and forgot my roots. James looked up from his wound and stretched out a hand and a small vortex of force formed before wildly spreading. Elleron couldn't even react before the spreading dome of energy passed through him, but when he looked down, he didn't seem to be harmed at all. There were 5 tiers of the energy shield ability index. Partiality, misdirection, nullification, reflection and amplification. As usual, the last tier was restricted to savants only. The first tier partially blocked attacks, the second could misdirect them, the third could fully nullify them, and the last could reflect them. With James' level of control, he even directly absorbed Elleron's force, only releasing it when he felt like it. He had brought reflection to its utmost limits. However, this wasn't his limit in the slightest. His ultimate defense couldn't even be called reflection any longer. Instead, it was more accurate to call it absorption. When he applied absorption on his body alone, any force attacks would be directly swallowed up by him, unable to cause any damage whatsoever and even allowing him to use it in his next assault. When he applied absorption in a domain, well, Elleren's pupils constricted into pinholes. He suddenly couldn't sense any time force whatsoever, and without atmospheric time force to observe, there were likewise no causalities to observe. Suddenly, Elleren froze, a fist suddenly appearing before his face. Don't look distracted now, I still need you to make this look like it's difficult. Bang! Elleren was once again sent flying. Chapter 1902. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:48 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1902. Annoying if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. James unleashed a concussive barrage, his violent assault practically leaving craters all across Elleren's body. All of the force in the domain was absorbed by him, fueling his power to the point that he seemed beyond superhuman. Nothing Elleren did seemed to be good enough. Noah, who stood a distance away, breathing hard, could hardly mask the complicated look in his eyes. It felt as though he was watching another Lionel crush him in all aspects he held dear. It was just Lionel, or even now James. He also had to experience Miguel surpassing him in all aspects as well. Though he didn't know where Miguel was now, and he had done nothing but work hard all these years, he still knew deep inside that he had yet to catch up to him either. No matter how Noah racked his brain, he couldn't understand what the difference was. Was his will not great enough? But how much had he been willing to sacrifice for Earth? How much of his life had he dedicated to causes that were anything but selfish? It just felt frustrating. He should have felt happy that Earth seemed to have been saved, but instead he felt inferior. Jessica looked toward Noah's side profile and sighed herself. She wanted to comfort him, but she had tried many times before. This simply wasn't something that an outside force could help with. K. Lionel's eyes flashed open, a strong vitality rippling out from him. With just a single breath, he felt as though he had been revitalized. He jumped to his feet, stretching and unleashing a roar. The leaves rustled wildly and the earth quaked, a cyclone of wind spiraling into his lungs. His body felt light and the confidence in his eyes couldn't have been sharper. Lionel turned toward a certain direction. There, on the other side of his barrier, a smiling youth with bronzed skin stood. It seemed that this youth had been watching him sleep all the while, a prospect that likely would have left most uncomfortable, but Lionel only smiled. An odd light flashed within Idrim's eyes. Of all the responses he had expected, this was the last one. However, what he didn't know was that even with his ability index sealed, Lionel's emotional intelligence was still off the charts. How could he not tell what Idrim was trying to do? Unfortunately for him, unsettling someone like Lionel wasn't so easy. With a thought, Lionel communicated with the orb and released the hold on his barrier, allowing Idrim to walk right through. Taking it as an invite, Idrim strolled in with a radiant smile. His every action seemed like he was perfectly photo-ready. It was aggravating in an almost too obvious kind of way, almost like Idrim knew what he was doing and yet did so anyway, as though he couldn't tell that it came off as fake. I didn't expect that the anomaly this time would be a human. Quite fascinating. Color me surprised. I guess there really are a multitude of variables in the universe. Lionel's lip curled. Indeed, so it probably isn't all that surprising to find a creep who likes watching people sleep among so many variables, right? Idrim laughed. Sorry if I made you uncomfortable, but you see there's only the two of us remaining, so there really was no point in returning to my own territory. This made it more convenient for the both of us, no? That much I agree with. Lionel reached for his back and unsheathed his spear from its holster, the white fur that coated his body fluttering in the wind. He took a casual glance toward the spear in Idrim's hand and realized that it was in the gold grade, but he didn't seem surprised. He had long since expected this. Idrim's spear vibrated slightly as he sighed. I have to say, this is a bit unfortunate. This battle won't be very fair. If it was in the outside world, we could battle our heart's content. It's a shame, I was looking forward to this. Lionel yawned, expelling his last bit of fatigue as his body slowly woke all the way up. His cells thrummed, his heart pounded and his blood gushed. He felt light on his feet and his spear truly felt like an extension of his arm. You know, I thought I was annoying, but that seems to be a standout feature for you all. Tell you what, I doubt your recovery abilities are anywhere near as annoying as that fiend demon. If you can last 100 attacks of my spear, it'll let you get a free shot in. Idrim paused, suddenly not knowing what to say. If Lionel was going to say something like, should he have chosen a lower number? Also, what did free shot mean? Shouldn't he have said that he would willingly give up? Was he just trying to toy with him? What he didn't know was that Lionel was dead serious. Idrim didn't stand a chance against him. Lionel's figure suddenly rippled and he vanished. When he appeared again, his spear was already at Idrim's throat, causing the latter's pupils to constrict. But rather than dodging, to Lionel's surprise, Idrim didn't move at all, instead choosing to directly counter. Lionel's gaze turned fierce. Swift. Idrim sensed that something was wrong and hurried changed tactics, diving to the side. Shying. The sound of blades sharpening echoed through the air, but moments later, a harsh ripping sound replaced it. Idrim rolled to the side, popping up to his feet and hurriedly retreating. When he came to a stop, he slowly dodged his neck. He felt something moist that caused him to freeze, not quite believing it. But when he slowly brought it to his line of sight, there was a drizzle of bronze-gold blood running down his fingers, dripping down the length of his finger and falling to the ground. Lionel flicked his wrist and the blood that had coated his blade rushed out, tearing a hole through a nearby tree. Chapter 1903. Published at 8th of June 2023 9:48 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 1903. Hard if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel glanced at this blood for a moment. He had felt the heft of it weighing down his spear, so he had gotten rid of it. That blood would be quite annoying to deal with. Not only was it incredibly heavy, but it was sticky and viscous, latching onto the metal of his blade and seemingly trying to corrode it as well. If not for his spear force, that would have already happened. Interesting. Lionel smiled. Idrim had long fallen into silence, the small crater his blood left in the ground resting in the periphery of his sight. Lionel hopped just once and suddenly shot forward. He didn't have the patience to wait for Idrim to think his way through this existential crisis. Human, Rapax, nomad, cloud, dwarven or spiritual, none of it mattered to him. Anyone who stood in his way would taste his blade. A radiant bronze aura formed around Idrim as he looked up, his smile vanishing, replaced by a steely cold gaze. However, in the face of it, Lionel's smile only brightened. Is that your real face? Show me more of it. Bang! Their spears crossed once before they separated and went at it again. Idrim's senses were sharp and he seemed to respond to every one of Lionel's attempts in kind. When Lionel's spear separated into three, his separated into three as well. When Lionel swung the butt of his spear forward, so did he. When Lionel spun his spear and geared up his momentum, so did he. It didn't seem like he was trying to follow the path of the cloud race, but rather trying to attack Lionel's psyche. Even so, Lionel's smile never faded. Suddenly, Lionel's spear split into 4, then 5, then 6, then 7. Every time Idrim matched him, he took another step forward, edging the battlefield as though he was making sweet love to it. Everything about the smile on his face to the fluid shifts between attacks and defense, between lunges and retreats, between thrusts and slices, was absolutely seamless. Lionel truly learned how fun it was to fight without having to think. He couldn't see 10, 20, or even 100 moves ahead like he could usually. In fact, he could barely see 3. However, these 3 moves were like they were ingrained into his very bones, as though he already knew how to react to them without having to deduce at all. He could entirely focus on the feeling of his blade gliding through the air, the sound of his spear force splitting the wind, the echo of a clash of blades. It was therapeutic in a way he had never experienced before, an escape from any and everything. His style was absolutely suffocating, his spear came from any and everywhere, until it suddenly began to come from any time as well. His rhythm shifted, and his perfectly paced blade suddenly slowed by a small margin, causing Idrim to mistime a block and overshoot his target. Lionel's blade snaked through and pierced through his collarbone, pulling back just as Idrim swung back to counter and thrusting forward with a strike that was twice as fast as any of his other strikes, piercing the other side of Idrim's collarbone. Any normal human would experience both of their arms becoming useless at this point, but Idrim only clenched his jaw, a mysterious power brandishing his spear with the same ease as he had previously. The bronze aura around him grew and the heaviness of Lionel's spear seemed to increase. Lionel looked down at his blade. It was becoming unruly and difficult to control. He slid back, dodging out of the way of Idrim's counter and slipping it. He took a strong step forward, ducking under Idrim's thrusting blade and closing the distance. He made a move to raise his spear and end the battle, but at that moment Idrim's gaze seemed to blaze with life. The blood that coated Lionel's spear became hundreds of times heavier. Lionel had so much of his weight leaning forward to complete his attack that it was too difficult to stop the momentum, especially given its suddenness. Lionel hadn't considered the possibility that a spiritual could control their body parts outside of themselves. It was too easy to get caught off guard when you couldn't think of millions of possibilities at once. Idrim's knee drove up with an incredible amount of force and Lionel seemed to present his jaw to him. A sickening crack echoed and Lionel felt his brain rattle. The heaviness of Idrim's blood was nothing compared to the heaviness of his body. If it wasn't because Idrim had to hurriedly take the opportunity and couldn't grab a hold of a solid foundation, Lionel's head would have likely exploded like a watermelon with that single exchange. Lionel's teeth cracked and his jaw broke into at least 3 pieces. His head was driven upward as though Idrim was trying to rip it from his shoulders with that single knee. Idrim took a step back to stabilize himself and prepared a second attack immediately, retrieving his spear while Lionel was still in a partial daze and piercing right for his heart. Lionel's brain continued to rattle around in his head, but a faint voice in his head told him that if he didn't get a hold of himself immediately he would die here. Falling into a daze in the middle of battle was the greatest taboo. If it wasn't for the fact their true strength was suppressed here, these last few split seconds would have already been enough for his life to be severed. However, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't seem to. Without his ability index, he couldn't take forceful control of his body without active participation of his brain, and right now it might as well have been mush. Just move to the side, something, anything. The roaring echo of Lionel's soul seemed to reverberate through the dimensions, a burst of a violet aura pulsing to life around him. Suddenly he could see, but it wasn't through the blurriness of his eyes, but rather through the tip of his spear. As Idrim thrust forward with victory in his eyes, Lionel's spear seemed to move as though it had a mind of its own, being guided not by his hand, but rather the will that pulsed from his heart. PCHU. Idrim froze, looking down at his chest, the butt of Lionel's silver-grade spear jetting out of it. You're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.